She climbed into that man's lap with cold, calculated precision. Not by accident, not by impulse, but because she had already read the message. The message from his wife. The woman who had spent 14 months surviving needles and silence and loss, who was walking through that door right now holding the most important photograph she had ever touched in her life. Vanessa Hale checked her phone one last time, confirmed the timestamp, and smiled. She knew exactly how many seconds she had. If that had been you, if you had walked through that door and seen what Celeste saw, what would you have done? Subscribe to this channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you, what happens next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning Celeste Vescari decided to surprise her husband started the way most mornings had for the past 5 years, quietly and alone. She woke before the alarm. That was an old habit, one she had carried out of a childhood where silence was the only luxury the family could afford. She lay in a bed that felt too large even after half a decade of marriage, staring at a ceiling that was too high, and she pressed one flat palm against her stomach the way she had been doing for 3 days straight. Not consciously. Just the way the body moves toward what it is trying to protect before the mind has caught up with the decision. 3 days since the clinic called. 3 days since a nurse on the other end of the phone used the word positive as casually as if she said it 100 times a week, which she probably did. And Celeste had sat down on the bathroom floor still holding the receiver because her legs simply stopped working beneath her. She sat there for a long time. Long enough that the floor tiles left faint marks on the backs of her legs. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted and moved across the wall, and she didn't notice. She had not told Damien yet. That wasn't fear. People who didn't know Damien Vescari were afraid of him. People who did know him were terrified. But Celeste had never quite fit into either category. She had married him at 26, when his reputation was already carved from something harder than granite, and his name alone could empty a room in under 60 seconds. She'd known exactly what he was when she chose him. She had chosen him anyway, for reasons that made more sense to her then than they did now. Though she still wasn't sorry. She hadn't told him because she wanted to do it right. After 14 months of fertility treatments, after clinical rooms that smelled like antiseptic and quiet disappointment, after 2 losses so early that most people said they didn't count, though they counted to Celeste, they counted enormously. She had carried both of them in a private place inside herself that she had never fully shown anyone. She wanted this moment to mean something real and solid and unbreakable. She wanted to hand him something he could hold. So she had called the clinic the afternoon before and asked them to print the ultrasound image. At 8 weeks, the technician explained, it looked like a small bean with a pulse. The woman had smiled and tilted her screen toward Celeste and said, "You can actually see the flutter right there. The heartbeat is strong." Strong. Celeste had driven home with that word sitting in her chest like something lit from the inside. She dressed slowly that morning, more slowly than usual, more carefully than she had dressed in months. The dark blue dress that Damien had once told her made her look like she owned every room she walked into. The small pearl earrings, his first gift to her, before they were officially anything, back when he was still pretending they were just business acquaintances, and she was already pretending to believe him. She did her hair. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. She looked tired. The months of treatment had taken something from her face that she wasn't sure she could get back. The skin around her eyes was thinner. There were lines that hadn't existed a year ago. But her eyes were clear. Her hands had stopped their constant shaking for the first time in months. And she believed, she genuinely, wholly believed, that this was the morning everything was going to turn around. She picked up the envelope. She texted Damien at 9:47 in the morning. "I'm coming to surprise you. Don't panic. It's a good surprise." She smiled when she typed it, because that was the thing nobody on the outside ever understood about Damien Vescari. The man who dismantled rival organizations with the same composure most people used to order coffee was quietly, genuinely terrible at surprises. He didn't like not knowing what was coming. It was one of the few things about him that had always made her feel tenderly toward him, that small gap in all that armor, that one place where the man underneath showed through. What she did not know What she had no possible way of knowing was that Vanessa Hale had already read that message before it reached him. What she did not know was that Vanessa had been Parton intercepting messages for 4 months. What she did not know was that her text had started a countdown. The Viscari building downtown was 40 stories of glass and steel, the legitimate face of everything Damien controlled. Celeste had been here dozens of times. The security team on the ground floor knew her on sight, and they waved her through with the particular deference that comes from understanding that Celeste Viscari was not a woman you kept waiting and not a woman you questioned. She took the private elevator to the 38th floor. The ride up was 38 floors of quiet. She held the envelope in both hands. She thought about what his face would look like when he understood what she was handing him. She thought about the word strong. She thought about telling the story later. The surprise, the elevator, the envelope, and the way it would become one of those stories a family tells for years at the dinner table. The doors opened. The corridor was quieter than usual. She noticed that the absence of the low hum of activity that normally existed on this floor, the assistants who were always stationed outside the main suite, the sound of keyboards and phones doing their constant background work. The outer office was empty. The reception desk sat unoccupied, the chair pushed back as though whoever had been sitting there had left in a hurry or had been asked to leave. She did not think much of it. She had never needed to think much about what Damien's building was doing. It was his world, not hers, and she had always been content to pass through it as a visitor. She walked to the heavy oak door of his private office. She pushed it open. What she saw in the next 4 seconds rearranged something inside her that she would spend the rest of her life trying to put back in order and never fully managing to. Damien was in his chair behind his desk. That was ordinary. That was expected. But Vanessa Hale, his secretary, 29 years old, recently promoted, relentlessly efficient, a woman Celeste had exchanged pleasantries with at company events and thought nothing particular about, was not standing near him. She was not working beside him. She was sitting in his lap, sideways, with one arm draped easily across his shoulders, the other extending a glass of whiskey toward his mouth. She was laughing. The sound of her laughter was bright and entirely unself-conscious, and it stopped the very instant that Celeste pushed open the door. Damien's hands were at Vanessa's waist, not pushing her away, not startled, reaching to correct something wrong, resting, like it was natural, like it was a position they had arrived at without much thought and remained in without discomfort. The room went silent in pieces, the laughter first, then the motion of Vanessa's body as she registered who was standing in the doorway, then the sound of the whiskey glass being set down too fast and scraping hard against the surface of the desk. Celeste did not move. She was still holding the envelope. Some distant, analytical part of her brain had apparently decided to stay operational while the rest of her short-circuited completely. She was aware that she was standing very still, that her face probably showed nothing at all, because the thing happening inside her was too large to fit into any expression that exists in the human vocabulary. Damien stood up. Vanessa slid off him. The whiskey glass caught the edge of the desk and fell sideways and shattered on the polished marble floor. And Damien said her name, Celeste, in a voice she had never once heard from him before. Not the boardroom voice, not the dangerous voice that made other men careful about what they did next. Something underneath both of those. Something that had no armor left on it at all. The envelope slipped from her fingers. She watched it fall. She watched the ultrasound photograph slide halfway out onto the floor. That small black and white image, the kidney bean with its strong heartbeat and the technician's arrow pointing toward everything. And she watched Damien's eyes drop to it. She watched the exact moment he understood what he was looking at. His face did something she had never seen it do. It broke. Not dramatically, not with sound or movement. It just lost its structure, the way a building looks in the fraction of a second before a demolition charge brings it down. Still standing, already gone. She bent down. She picked up the photograph. She slid it back into the envelope with hands that were, somehow, steady. She stood up straight. She looked at her husband, at the man she had chosen with full knowledge of what he was, and had never once regretted choosing until this exact moment. And she said the only thing she could locate inside herself that didn't require screaming. "Congratulations," she said. "It looks like you've already chosen your future." She turned around. She walked back through the door. She pressed the elevator button. She rode down 38 floors alone. She drove home, packed one bag with the efficient practicality of a woman raised to handle disasters without an audience, called a car service, and was gone before Damien's first phone call reached her voicemail. She didn't answer. She didn't listen to the message. She didn't turn around. The calls started within 20 minutes. First Damien, then Luca Ferris, his consigliere, a man Celeste had always found quietly reliable in the specific way of people who have survived long enough to learn that most crises are best handled with patience and very few words. Then numbers she didn't recognize at all. She turned the phone off somewhere on the highway heading north. She didn't make a dramatic decision about it. She just turned it off, placed it on the passenger seat, and watched the city dissolve in the rear-view mirror until it was just a smear of gray light behind her. She drove. She didn't cry. The tears hadn't come yet. That was something she understood from the two previous losses. Real grief doesn't arrive at the moment of impact. It waits. It finds you later, in some ordinary moment, some mundane task, and then it hits all at once with the accumulated weight of everything you held together when you were supposed to fall apart. She was still holding together. She had a reason to hold together. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach while the other held the wheel, and she thought about that word, strong, and she let it do the work it needed to do. 4 hours north of the city, the road blurred. She pulled into a roadside diner and sat with the engine running for a long time before she went in. She ordered coffee she didn't drink. She ordered pie she didn't eat. She sat in a booth near the window and watched the afternoon become early evening, and she took the ultrasound photograph out of the envelope and set it on the table and looked at it. She thought about 14 months. The needles, the waiting rooms with their soft watercolor prints and their boxes of tissues placed strategically on end tables. The phone calls received in parking lots and bathroom stalls because she couldn't bear to receive bad news somewhere people would feel compelled to comfort her. The 2 mornings she had woken up knowing before any test confirmed it. She thought about the way Damien had gone completely still and said nothing for a long time after the second loss, and then put both arms around her without words, because he understood at least in that moment that words were useless. She had believed they were the same kind of broken. She had believed they were in it together. She picked up her phone, turned it on. 11 missed calls from Damien, 3 from Luca, 2 from numbers she didn't recognize. She turned it off again. And then, sitting in that diner booth with the photograph on the table in front of her, she made herself 3 decisions. The first, she was not going back. The second, no one from Damien's world would know where she went. The third, this child would know nothing about his father's empire until she decided otherwise, which might be never, and she was prepared to live with that. The third one was the one she felt least certain about. It sat alongside the warmth of that word the technician had used, and the two things coexisted without resolution. She took the small notebook she always kept in her bag and began writing down everything she actually owned that was hers alone. Not the joint accounts, not the properties in the family name. The things that had belonged to Celeste Marchetti before she became Celeste Viscari. She had kept a personal savings account under her maiden name throughout the marriage. Not because she had ever planned to use it this way, because she had grown up in a family with no safety net, and she had never been able to entirely let go of the anxiety of having nothing that was purely hers. She was grateful for that anxiety now. The list was shorter than she would have liked, but it was enough. She left the diner. She drove 2 more hours north. She found a motel with a vacancy sign that actually worked, paid cash, locked the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed in the too bright overhead light, and then, in a room where no one could see her, and no one could help her, and no one could mistake her devastation for weakness, Celeste Viscari put her face in her hands. The tears arrived, all at once, the way real grief always does. Back in the city, Damien Viscari stood in his office long after the last person had gone home for the night. The ultrasound photograph was on his desk. He had placed it there carefully after picking it up off the floor, the way you handle something that has already been damaged and cannot afford to be damaged further. He had made 47 phone calls. He had deployed every resource available to him, and those resources were considerable. Hotels, car rental companies, Celeste's few close friends, each of whom received a call with the same answer. "I don't know where she is. I haven't heard from her." Damien, what did you do? Her sister in Philadelphia. The clinic where she had been receiving treatment for 14 months. Nothing. His wife had walked out of his life with one bag, one photograph, and 5 years of accumulated grief. And she had vanished as completely as though she had stepped off the edge of the world. His consigliere, Luca Ferris, found him there. 63 years old, white-haired, with the patient bearing of a man who had worked beside Damien's father before he worked beside Damien and had learned in 40 years that the most useful thing you can do when a dangerous man is at his lowest point is simply stay in the room and not make it worse. Luca sat down without being asked. He looked at the photograph on the desk. He said nothing. She was pregnant, Damien said, finally, into the silence. She was coming to tell me. Luca closed his eyes briefly, a thing he almost never did. Vanessa said she tripped, Damien said. The corner of the desk. She tripped and… Damien, Luca said, I know what it looked like. Do you know what it was? Luca said. The question sat between them without an answer. Damien stood and walked to the window. The city was 40 stories below him, indifferent and relentless and entirely uninterested in what had just collapsed up here. He stood with his hands behind his back and he thought about the geometry of it. Vanessa's chair, the desk, the distance between where she sat and where she had ended up, the physics of a trip that would have required her to fall sideways and slightly forward across 6 feet of carpet and land in a position that needed some rearrangement once she got there. He had accepted that explanation in the chaos of the moment. He was not accepting it now. He turned from the window and picked up his phone. Get me Reeves, he said. Tonight. Reeves arrived within the hour. Former military, precise in his speech, a man who understood that careless answers cost more than silence. He confirmed in person what Damien already suspected was coming. The security footage from the 38th floor for the 2 hours surrounding Celeste's arrival did not exist. Not corrupted. Not misfiled. Gone. Deleted cleanly, with the kind of precision that required access to the primary server and the override codes, both held by exactly 6 people in the organization. How long, Damien said, would it take someone to learn the system well enough to do this? Reeves considered it carefully. Months, he said, at minimum. Damien nodded slowly, not a moment of bad judgment, not an impulsive action taken in panic, a campaign. Someone had been planning this for months. He sat back in his chair and looked at the photograph on his desk and thought about that. The patience of it, the precision of it, the fact that the scene Celeste had walked into had been constructed rather than discovered. And somewhere beneath the machinery of strategy and response that his mind had already started running, something simpler was running simultaneously. He was afraid. Not of what Vanessa had done, not of what enemies might do with his distraction, afraid of something much simpler and much harder to address than any of that. Afraid that the story Celeste believed right now was, in every way that actually mattered, the truth, not the facts. The facts might eventually exonerate him, but the facts couldn't answer the real question, the one he'd been circling since the moment that door swung closed and he heard the elevator arrive and understood she was leaving. Why, in 5 years of marriage, had he given Celeste so little reason to stay that one bad morning was enough to make her walk out? He didn't have an answer. He set the photograph down. He would find her. He would explain everything. But somewhere underneath that certainty, in a part of himself he rarely visited, he understood that explaining everything was not the same as fixing anything, and fixing anything was not the same as deserving to. The city hummed 40 stories below him. And somewhere out there, his wife was driving north in the dark with his child and her silence, and there was not a single weapon in his considerable arsenal that could bring either of them back to him tonight. 3 days after Celeste Viscari disappeared, the rumor reached Damien's desk in the form of a printed email. Not a report, not an intelligence brief. An email forwarded 6 times through various organizational channels, originally sent from an anonymous address to 4 senior members of his network. Reeves had placed it on the desk without comment, which was how Reeves communicated that he considered something significant without wanting to be the one to say so first. The subject line read, "The boss has moved on." The body contained 2 sentences. Damien Viscari has already replaced his wife with his secretary. The Viscari family is under new management. Damien read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read it a third time, the way you reread something when the words don't change but some part of you keeps hoping they will. Luca was sitting across from him. He had been arriving before anyone else every morning since the incident, making coffee in the small machine on the credenza, sitting in the same chair, being present the way old men who have survived many disasters know how to be present, without commentary, without urgency, without the exhausting impulse to fill every silence with something useful. "When did this go out?" Damien said. "Reeves thinks Tuesday night," Luca said. "Around 9. Tuesday night was 36 hours after Celeste walked out. "Someone moved fast," Damien said. "Someone was ready," Luca said. Neither of them needed to say anything further. Moving fast meant opportunism. Being ready meant preparation. It meant someone had known in advance that there would be wreckage to exploit. Damien folded the paper once and placed it in the top drawer of his desk with the precise care of a man filing something he intends to return to. "Where is she?" he said. The question was not about Vanessa. Luca shook his head slightly. Not an answer, but not nothing. It meant, we're still looking, we haven't stopped, give it more time. He had deployed 3 separate teams, not from Damien's usual network, because Damien's usual network had apparently developed a leak, but old contacts from the generation before this one. Men who worked without phones and didn't discuss their assignments and billed nothing to paper. "She was never trained to disappear," Damien said. He wasn't criticizing her. It came out sounding almost like the opposite. "No," Luca agreed. "She figured it out on her own." Damien stood and walked to the window. The city was gray that morning, low clouds sitting on top of the taller buildings, the kind of November weather that makes everything look slightly unreal. He had not slept more than 2 hours in 3 consecutive nights. He was not going to mention that. It was also not something he was going to pretend away, because Luca would see through it in 4 seconds and find the pretense insulting. "Tell me what Reeves found," he said. Luca opened the folder on his knee. Vanessa Hale's access logs for the past 6 months ran to 11 pages. Reeves had stayed up 2 straight nights compiling them, cross-referencing timestamps against organizational events, meeting schedules, communication records. The pattern that emerged was not subtle once you knew to look. She had accessed the communications server 47 times outside of regular work hours. She had run searches on Celeste Viscari's personal contact list on 8 separate occasions. She had flagged 17 incoming messages addressed to Damien from his wife's personal account, applying a filter that diverted them to a secondary folder he would never think to check because he didn't know it existed. Damien listened to all of it without turning from the window. "How many messages did Celeste send?" he said. Reeves counted 31 filtered messages over 4 months, Luca said. Some were mundane, scheduling, reminders, but some of them... He paused in the specific way Luca paused when what came next required the other person to be still for it. Some of them weren't. Damien turned from the window. "Read me one," he said. Luca looked down at the page. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing carefully, because some information, once spoken aloud in a room, changes the temperature of everything that comes after it and cannot be taken back. He read, "I know you've been pulling back, and I don't know what I did. I keep waiting for you to tell me. I'm not angry. I just need to know if you're still here with me or if I'm making this up. See." The room held completely still. Damien said nothing. He walked back to his desk and sat down and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a long moment. His hands were steady. He wished for a second that they weren't. "When was that sent?" he said. 7 weeks ago, Luca said. 7 weeks ago, Damien had been consumed by a territorial dispute with a family in Boston that had eaten 2 full months of his attention. He had told himself Celeste understood. He had always told himself she understood, because in 5 years she had never once asked for more than he could give, and he had read that silence as contentment rather than as the sound of a woman managing her own fear alone. He had never considered that she might be asking. He had never considered that the asking was being intercepted. He picked up the phone on his desk. "Get me Vanessa Hale," he said. "Today." They brought her in through the service entrance. Not the usual route for a suspended employee called in for questioning, But Damien had made a decision about optics. He didn't want anyone in the lobby watching her walk through the front door, looking like she still belonged there. She did not look like she belonged anywhere when they brought her into the conference room on the 37th floor. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, hands folded on the table in a posture designed to communicate composure, which communicated instead that she was concentrating very hard on her hands. She had the look of someone who had spent 3 days rehearsing what to say and was now sitting in the actual moment of having to say it, which is never as controlled as the rehearsal feels. Damien walked in alone. No Luca. No Reeves. He set a single sheet of paper on the table between them, a printout of her access log. The 17 filtered messages, dates, and timestamps visible in a clean column on the left side of the page. She looked at it. Her face did something controlled and complicated. "Damien," she started. "Don't," he said. Just the one word, not loud, not accompanied by anything physical. Just don't. In a voice that had ended larger conversations than this one, and she stopped. "I want to ask you one thing," he said, "and I want you to understand that the answer you give me in the next 10 seconds is going to determine whether this conversation is the worst thing that has ever happened to you or whether it's merely the most unpleasant." She was very still. "Did you know she was coming that morning?" he said. "Tuesday. Did you know when she would arrive?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time in a room with no other noise in it. She wet her lips. "Her message came through before yes or no," Damien said. Another beat. Shorter this time, like something giving way under pressure. "Yes," she said, barely audible. The words sat on the table between them like something dropped from a height. Damien leaned back in his chair. He looked at her the way he looked at a contract when he was finding the clause that would eventually destroy the person who had signed it, not with anger, with a kind of exhausted precision that was somehow worse than anger because it left no room for the possibility that any of this was accidental. "You read her message," he said. "You knew when she was arriving, and then you came into my office and sat in my lap and made sure you were still there when the door opened. It wasn't—" She stopped. Started again. "You don't understand what the dynamic was like. The way she pulled you back every time you started moving forward. The way she made everything about the treatments, the losses, the—" "Don't," he said again. She closed her mouth. "You don't get to explain my wife to me," he said, each word flat and even and carrying its full weight without any extra force behind it. "You don't get to tell me what my marriage was like. You don't get to justify this by deciding you understood something I didn't." She looked at the table. "The filtered messages," he said. "How long?" She didn't answer immediately, and that delay was its own answer, carrying more information than whatever word came out of her mouth eventually would. 4 months, she said. "What else?" A longer pause. "Vanessa." His voice dropped slightly, which was more threatening than if it had risen, because the drop meant he had moved past the part of himself that needed volume to communicate danger. "What else?" She exhaled. The exhale of someone who has been holding something compressed for a very long time and has finally run completely out of the energy required to keep it contained. She told him about the deleted security footage. She told him about the anonymous email. She hadn't sent it herself, she said. She'd given material to someone else who had, though the distinction seemed to matter considerably more to her than it did to him. She told him about 2 phone calls she had intercepted from Celeste to the building's main reception desk, calls she had rerouted or declined on the pretense that Damien was unavailable and couldn't be disturbed. And then she told him about the photograph, a physical photograph, printed, no return address, that had arrived in Celeste's personal mail at the house 4 months ago. A photograph of Damien and Vanessa standing close together at a company event, taken from across the room at an angle that made a professional exchange look like something private, like something that was deliberately being kept from someone. Celeste had mentioned it to her sister in Philadelphia. The sister had mentioned it to a mutual acquaintance. The acquaintance had eventually mentioned it back to Vanessa. "Did you send it?" Damien said. "No," she said, "but you knew who did." She didn't answer, which was an answer. Damien stood from the table. He picked up the access log from the surface between them. You're going to write down everything, he said. Every action, every date, every person involved in any part of this, all of it. Reeves will sit with you and you will leave nothing out. She nodded, a small, tight motion. And then you're going to understand something. He held the page at his side. Whatever you thought you were building, by taking apart what I had, it's gone. Every version of it. Whatever future you imagined for yourself in this building, in this organization, in any proximity to my life, gone. The only question remaining is what shape the gone takes. He walked to the door. Reeves will be here in 5 minutes, he said, without turning around. He left her sitting at that table with her composure in pieces on the floor around her, and he walked down the hall and around the corner and leaned against the wall in the stairwell and stood there for approximately 40 seconds with his eyes closed, which was the closest he was going to allow himself to anything that looked like falling apart. 40 seconds. Then he straightened, opened the door, and walked back out. The financial irregularities that Luca had been quietly tracking came into focus that same afternoon. He laid them out on the conference table with the methodical care of a man who has spent a lifetime delivering bad news and has learned that the delivery matters as much as the content. Spreadsheets. Transaction records. 3 separate accounts running parallel to legitimate business lines, pulling small amounts, never large enough to trigger automatic flags, and routing them through a series of holding entities to a destination that, once you followed it far enough, connected to a family out of Providence that had been trying to establish a foothold in Damien's territory for 2 years. She was feeding them information, Damien said. Financial structures, Luca said. Client relationships, some operational details, nothing catastrophic individually, but enough. They've been positioning, quietly, using what she gave them. How long? The account activity starts about 8 months ago. 8 months. 2 months before the filtered messages began, which meant Vanessa Hale had not improvised a betrayal in a moment of bad judgment. She had constructed one, piece by piece, with a timeline and parallel tracks designed to reinforce each other. The personal destruction of his marriage running alongside the professional undermining of his organization both pointed at the same outcome. She was going to wait until I was isolated, Damien said. Not a question. That's what it looks like, Luca said. No wife, no anchor. No one close enough to notice the slow leak, and then someone makes you an offer or a demand, and you're in a position where you accept terms you would never have accepted 2 years ago. Damien nodded slowly. There's something else, Luca said. Damien waited. The lipstick, Luca said, on your collar, 4 months ago, the one Celeste found. Damien went very still. He remembered it. A Sunday morning. Celeste in the kitchen, holding the collar of his shirt between 2 fingers with an expression that was not accusatory, that was never her style, but was measuring something, taking stock of whether the ground beneath her feet was solid or whether she had been telling herself a story about solid ground that wasn't entirely true. He had told her it was nothing. He had genuinely believed it was nothing. He had no memory of how it got there, and he had not thought about it again after that morning. Vanessa, he said, she was standing behind you in the elevator on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks before that Sunday, Luca said. Security log from the elevator camera. She reached forward and touched the back of your collar. 37 seconds. You were on your phone. Damien absorbed this. A deliberate stain, applied while he was distracted, placed there and left for Celeste to find at a moment that was guaranteed to land without explanation. How many of these were there? How many small, careful acts of damage had been inserted into the fabric of his marriage while he was looking at something else? While he was on the phone, in the meeting, managing something that felt urgent and turned out to be exactly what someone needed him to be focused on. He thought about Celeste's message. I just need to know if you're still here with me or if I'm making this up. She hadn't been making it up. She had been detecting something real, the slow, patient accumulation of false evidence. She had trusted her instincts. She had been right. And then she had walked into that office on the morning she should have walked into the best day of the year. Damien put both palms flat on the conference table and leaned forward, staring at the surface of it, and he stayed that way for several seconds without speaking. Luca stayed quiet beside him. He was very good at that. Double the team's looking for her, Damien said. Already done, Lucas said. The call came in at 11:47 that night. Reeves answered on the first ring, listened for 40 seconds without speaking, then walked directly to the residential suite where Damien had been staying rather than return to the empty house. He knocked on the door. Damien opened it in the dark. He was clearly not dressed for bed. He was clearly not anywhere near bed. The Providence family made contact, Reeves said, through a third party. They want a meeting. Damien looked at him. When? He said. They're proposing Friday. Where? Neutral location. They suggested the Hargrove. Damien was quiet for a moment, suggesting the Hargrove was not an accident. It was a signal. We know the language. We know the protocol. Come talk to us like men who understand how these things work. And Vanessa? Damien said. She's finished her statement, Reeves said. All of it. She gave us 3 names from their side and confirmed the full timeline of the financial transfers. Damien nodded slowly. Something clarified in him in that moment. The particular quality of clarity that arrives when you have been looking at a complicated situation long enough that the shape of it finally becomes simple. Not easy. Simple. The way a chess game looks when you can finally see the shape of how it ends. Vanessa had been working with the Providence family. 8 months of patient, parallel work. Dismantling his marriage and undermining his organization at the same time, believing that by the time she was finished, he would be isolated enough and off balance enough that the approach from Providence would feel like a lifeline rather than a threat. She had almost been right. There was a version of this week in which Damien Vescari, genuinely blindsided by what he believed was his wife's response to his betrayal, had been sitting in this building angry and alone and dangerously willing to believe that his enemy's version of events was the real one. Cancel the meeting, Damien said. Reeves blinked. That was a reaction Reeves almost never permitted himself. Tell them I'm unavailable, Damien said, and then I want a full brief on their financial exposure. Every asset they have that touches anything in this city. Every point of pressure. A pause. We're not meeting them on their terms. We're not meeting them at all. Not yet. Reeves nodded and left. Damien closed the door. He stood in the dark room and let himself breathe. In 20 years, he had never had an enemy operate this close to the interior of his life without his knowledge. Never had a betrayal this patient, this carefully layered. It was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of attention. He had always looked outward. At the territory, the rivals, the shifting alliances. He had trusted the interior of his life to hold itself together without his supervision, and he had trusted Celeste to always be there, and he had never once asked himself whether she knew that. He walked to the window. The city ran 40 stories below, indifferent, relentless, entirely uninterested in any individual devastation occurring inside any individual building. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He could prove the conspiracy. He could expose Vanessa, dismantle the Providence family's positioning, rebuild everything they had tried to take from him. But he could not rebuild that morning. He could not give back the moment that should have existed. The door opening, Celeste standing there with the envelope extended, him taking it, understanding what he was holding. The moment that should have been the best one of the year, replaced by something that could never be entirely unmade, even when every fact was verified and laid out and confirmed. And that was when Reeves called a second time. Damien answered immediately. The backup server, Reeves said. His voice had a quality Damien had heard from him only twice before in 20 years. The careful, deliberate flatness of a man delivering something that is about to change the direction of everything. We need to talk about the backup server. The backup server was in a building Damien owned under a holding company with no visible connection to his name. The server room was in the basement, temperature controlled, access restricted to 4 people in the entire organization. Damien had built it 7 years ago, not because he anticipated any specific threat, but because he believed that information, like money, should never exist in only one location. Reeves brought him there at 6 the following morning. The lead had come from an unexpected direction, not from the access logs, not from Vanessa's statement, but from a technician named Garza who had been doing routine maintenance and noticed, almost in passing, that a mirroring protocol established 18 months ago had been quietly redirecting copies of certain file categories to the backup server rather than deleting them at the primary level. Security footage was one of those categories. Damien stood in the basement and looked at the monitor Garza had set up in the corner. He stood there for 40 minutes. He watched the outer suite footage first. Celeste arriving, the empty reception desk, the moment she paused outside the office door and stood there for 3 full seconds, adjusting the envelope in her hands, squaring her shoulders in the specific way of someone organizing their courage before walking into something important. The gesture was so entirely her that something in his chest shifted in a way he didn't have language for. Then he switched to the anteroom camera, which had a partial angle into the office through the doorway. He watched Vanessa enter his office 12 minutes before Celeste arrived. He watched her move around the desk. He watched her check the time on her phone. He watched her position herself in the chair beside his, and then, with a single glance toward the door, slide herself sideways onto his lap in one smooth, unhurried motion. The motion of someone executing something they have rehearsed and are executing correctly. He was on the phone in the footage, his back partially to the camera. He could see himself reach for her waist, not reaching for her, stabilizing. The instinctive grab of a man whose balance has been disrupted from behind without warning, the same way your hand shoots out when something knocks you sideways when you aren't expecting it. He watched the door open. He watched Celeste's face for the half second before she controlled it. He made himself watch every second, all of it, because looking away from damage doesn't make the damage not exist. When it was over, he straightened and stood with his back to the monitor. Multiple copies, he said. Off-site storage, separate locations, not connected to any of our existing systems. Already on it, Reeves said. Timestamp authentication, forensic verification. It needs to hold up. Garza can run it. It'll hold. Damien nodded once. He turned around and looked at the frozen frame on the monitor. Celeste in the doorway, the envelope half open on the floor, everything in the image balanced on the precise edge of the moment it shattered. And then he said to Garza, pull the anteroom footage for the past 8 months. I want to know every time she came into that office when she had no reason to be there. He walked back upstairs. In the car, Luca was already waiting. He got in and looked at Damien once and understood from that single look everything he needed to understand about what was on that server. It's all there, Damien said. Luca said nothing. She planned it down to the second. She checked her phone. She knew exactly when Celeste was going to walk through that door. The car moved through morning traffic. Gray light, the city starting its day around them. There's going to be a meeting, Damien said. Within the week, every senior member of the network, and I want Vanessa Hale in that room. Luca turned his head slightly. Present? Damien confirmed. I want her to answer for it in front of every person who heard the rumor she helped start. And Providence? They'll be represented, Damien said, whether they know they're invited or not. Luca nodded. He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded page. He held it out without speaking. Damien took it, unfolded it, read it. A medical record summary. It confirmed that Celeste had been 8 weeks pregnant when she arrived at the office. That part he already knew. What he had not known was the line near the top of the page, that she had been to the clinic the morning before. Not a routine appointment. An emergency visit. Early warning signs. She had been monitored for 3 hours. The doctor had told her everything looked stable, that the heartbeat remained strong, but that she should rest and avoid stress. She had left the clinic with that. She had driven home. She had put on the dark blue dress and the pearl earrings and picked up the envelope. She had done all of that. 3 hours in a clinic scared of losing a third pregnancy. A doctor telling her to be careful. To come tell him he was going to be a father. Damien sat with the document in his hands as the car moved through an intersection and stopped at a light and moved again. She was coming to me after a scare, he said. Yes, Luca said. She was coming to me because when something frightening turns out to be okay, you go to the person. You need to see the person. Yes, Luca said. Damien folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest, alongside the ultrasound photograph he had been carrying there for 10 days. He looked out the window. The city moved past. He did not speak again for the rest of the drive. But something had shifted in him, not toward anger, not toward the cold machinery of strategy and consequence that he was good at operating, toward something simpler and considerably harder. The understanding that the person he ultimately needed to answer to was not in a conference room or a courtroom or sitting across a table surrounded by dangerous men. She was in a coastal town 300 miles north, making grocery lists and learning bus schedules and deciding, day by day, decision by decision, whether the door back to him was still worth leaving open. And then Reeves called. "The financial irregularities," Reeves said. "We followed the second layer." And? A pause. The kind that Reeves almost never allowed himself. "It's not Providence," Reeves said. "It's not any external family." Damien waited. "It's Marco Denisi," Reeves said. The name landed in the car like something thrown through glass at speed. Marco Denisi. Not a rival, not a stranger wearing a friendly face. His cousin, actual blood, his mother's sister's son, 3 years younger. A man who had grown up in the same house during the years after Damien's father died, and there was nowhere else for either of them to go. Who had sat across from Damien at Sunday dinners for a decade. Who had been brought into the organization by Damien himself 20 years ago as one of the very first decisions Damien made when he took control, because he had believed there was no one he trusted more. Who had been at every Christmas. Who had toasted Damien's marriage to Celeste. Who had come to the fertility clinic with flowers after the second loss, and sat with them both in the waiting area, and said the right things the way someone says them when they genuinely mean them. Damien's jaw tightened so hard it hurt. "You're certain," he said. "The account structure leads back to a holding entity registered to a name Denisi used in his 20s, Reeves said. "The entity was dissolved 15 years ago, but the banking relationship was never fully closed. Someone went back to it. Someone who knew it existed." Only 2 people in the world knew that entity existed. Damien had created it. Marco had managed it. "Where is he right now?" Damien said. "He's been in the building all week," Reeves said carefully. "He's on the guest list for the meeting." Damien stared at the passing street outside the window without seeing it. His cousin. His cousin had built the financial trap, while Vanessa built the personal one, had timed them to land simultaneously, had understood that the 2 attacks needed to run in parallel to be effective, one destroying the man, one destroying the organization, both arriving from directions that would be examined separately because no one would think to connect them. No one except someone who had been inside both for 30 years. "Don't touch him," Damien said. "Understood," Reeves said. "Don't change anything. He attends the meeting. He sits in his usual chair. He behaves the way he always behaves." Damien's voice was steady, in the specific way of a man who has moved past anger into something colder and more permanent. "And I want a full accounting of every conversation he has had with Vanessa Hale in the past 12 months on my desk before 7 a.m. The call ended. The car moved through traffic. Luca was looking straight ahead through the windshield. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. 30 years. Sunday dinners. The right words in a hospital waiting room. Flowers. A man who had sat beside Damien at the lowest point of his marriage and performed grief and solidarity so convincingly that Damien had never once thought to look beneath the performance. Beneath it had been this: an 8-month campaign, a financial trap embedded inside the legitimate structures Damien had spent 2 decades building, a calculated partnership with a woman who was simultaneously tearing his marriage apart from the inside, but both of them working in parallel. Both pointed at the same outcome. And Marco had been in the building all week, sitting in his usual chair, nodding across tables, asking after Damien's health in the hallway with an expression of genuine concern, watching the wreckage he had helped engineer and showing nothing, feeling nothing that his face was willing to admit to. Damien pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Then he lowered it. "Get me home," he said. The car moved. Outside, the city went on being the city, indifferent and relentless and entirely uninterested in the fact that Damien Vescari had just discovered that the deepest betrayal of his life had not come from a rival, had not come from an enemy, had not come from any of the dangerous external places he had spent 20 years learning to watch. It had come from the chair 3 seats to his left at every table that had ever mattered, and the man sitting in that chair was already on the guest list for the meeting, already inside the building, already waiting. Damien did not sleep that night. He sat at the desk in the residential suite with the financial diagram spread across the surface in front of him and the ultrasound photograph propped against the lamp where he could see it. And he went through every document Reeves had compiled on Marco Denisi with the same systematic attention he had given to every significant decision of the past 20 years. Page by page, transaction by transaction, the holding entity, the banking relationship, the 3 months of embedded activity running silent and clean through the legitimate businesses, like a slow poison in a water supply that nobody had thought to test. He had built those businesses. He knew every structural detail of every account, every holding entity, every layer of separation. He had designed the architecture himself because he understood that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was allow his legitimate and illegitimate operations to become so tangled that one couldn't be separated from the other without destroying both. He had been proud of that separation. He had believed it was airtight. Marco had walked through it like it was made of paper, because Marco had been there when Damien designed it, had sat beside him at that very desk 20 years ago, in a different building when Damien was 28 and still learning the shape of what he had inherited, and Marco had listened to every decision and asked the right questions and offered the right suggestions, and Damien had taken all of it as loyalty, had taken it as the natural alignment of two men from the same blood doing the work together because there was nobody else they trusted enough. He sat with that for a long time. The account Reeves had described, the holding entity registered to a name Marco used in his 20s, a name Damien remembered because he had been the one to suggest it, sitting in a car outside a municipal office while Marco filled out paperwork and complained about the cold. Damien remembered that afternoon. He remembered the specific quality of the light, the way Marco had laughed about some small bureaucratic absurdity. And Damien had laughed too, and it had felt like the beginning of something solid between them, something that would hold. That afternoon was 22 years ago. He closed the folder. He put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the ultrasound photograph. The kidney bean. The arrow pointing to a heartbeat a technician had called strong. He thought about the flowers Marco had brought to the clinic after the second loss. The waiting area. The particular silence of that afternoon, 3 of them in plastic chairs, and Marco had said almost nothing, had simply been there, had pressed Damien's shoulder once with one hand without speaking, and Damien had understood it as the language of men who don't have adequate words for grief, and so choose presence instead. He understood now that he had been wrong about a great many things. At 4 a.m, he picked up his phone and called Luca. Luca answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "I want to know when it started," Damien said. "Not the account activity, not the Vanessa communications. I want to know when Marco decided. The actual moment. Whatever you can find." "I'll look," Luca said. "And Luca," Damien paused, "I want you next to me the entire time tomorrow." A brief silence. "I'll be there," Luca said. The morning arrived gray and cold. The kind of November morning that feels like the city is holding its breath before something happens that it has been expecting for a while. Reeves had the document package on Damien's desk by 6:45. The full accounting of Marco's communications with Vanessa Hale over 12 months, 17 exchanges in total, 3 of them occurring in the week before the incident in Damien's office. The conversations, reconstructed from deleted messages pulled from a secondary server backup, were not dramatic. That was the thing that struck Damien most when he read through them. They were practical. Calm. The tone of 2 professionals coordinating logistics for a project with a deadline. The timing needs to align with the Boston situation. He'll be distracted. She needs access to the filtered folder before the end of the month. Don't move on the accounts until after the personal situation destabilizes. Sequence matters. Sequence matters. Damien read that phrase twice. Then he set the document down. Then he got dressed in the dark suit he wore on important days, because his father had believed that the way you presented yourself on a difficult day was a form of statement, not vanity, a declaration of intent. "I am still here. Whatever you came to do, I am ready for it." He looked at himself in the mirror. He looked like a man who had not slept and who had arrived, through the specific crucible of 11 days of not sleeping, at a version of himself that was quieter and more stripped down than the version that had been sitting in his office on the morning everything changed. He picked up the ultrasound photograph from the desk. He put it in his shirt pocket, against his chest. He went downstairs. 17 men came to the meeting. They filed in at 9 in the morning and took their usual seats with the ease of long habit. Some of them had known Damien's father. All of them had at one point staked something significant on the reliability of the Viscari name. They ranged in age from 34 to 71, and they carried into that room the particular tension of men who have heard one version of events and are waiting to hear another, and are very carefully not showing which one they have provisionally decided to believe. Marco Denisi sat 3 chairs to Damien's left, where he always sat, in the chair he had occupied at every gathering of this kind for 15 years. Gray suit, a cup of coffee in front of him. He nodded at Damien when Damien entered the room, the easy, unhurried nod of a man with nothing sitting heavy on his conscience. And Damien nodded back with the same ease, and neither of them showed a single thing. That performance, Damien thought, cost Marco nothing, which told him everything he needed to know about exactly what he was dealing with. Luca sat at Damien's right. Reeves stood against the wall near the door, arms loose at his sides, watching the room with the patient attention of a man trained to notice the thing that happens a half second before anything else does. Damien let the room settle completely. He waited until every cup was down, every chair was still, every face was turned toward him. Then he put a remote on the table and turned on the screen at the far end of the room. "I called this meeting," he said, "because there are things you've heard that aren't true, and there are things you haven't heard that are. I'm going to spend the next hour making sure you have the accurate version of both." Nobody spoke. He started with the surveillance footage. He played the ante-room recording from beginning to end without commentary. Timestamp visible. Quality, clean. The room watched Vanessa position herself, check her phone, settle into place, and then watched Celeste walk through the door 40 seconds later. Watched the envelope fall. Watched Damien's hands go to Vanessa's waist in the instinctive grab of a man who has been knocked off balance from behind. The silence in the room during those 2 minutes and 14 seconds was the particular silence of men recalibrating something they had already partially decided. Not surprise exactly, something more considered. The silence of people watching a version of events get unmade in real time and making the private adjustment that requires. When it ended, Damien said, "The footage deleted from the primary server was recovered from a backup facility. Forensic authentication is in the packet in front of each of you. The timestamp is verified and will hold up to any external review." He watched the room absorb this. He watched Marco absorb it. Marco's expression was exactly right. A careful blend of vindication and grim understanding, the face of a man hearing something that confirms what he has privately suspected all along. It was a flawless performance. Damien had been watching Marco's face for 30 years, and he could not find a single crack in it, which made him considerably more dangerous than Vanessa had ever been. Vanessa had been tactical. Marco was surgical. "There's more," Damien said. He moved through the financial irregularities connected to Providence, the transfers, the account structures, the timeline. He presented it clean and factual, without theater, because these men didn't respond well to theater, and the facts were dramatic enough on their own. He explained how Vanessa had positioned herself within the organization's communication infrastructure over 8 months, the deleted messages, the planted photograph sent to the house, the lipstick on the collar. Every page in the packet before them was documented, sourced, and cross-referenced. When he finished, Caruso, 62, ran the Eastern financial structures, had been in this organization since before Damien was 20, looked up from the packet. "Where is she now? Hale." "Outside," Damien said. "She's going to come in and confirm this in person." Reeves opened the door. Vanessa Hale walked into the room. She was pale. She had aged something like 5 years and 11 days, the particular aging that comes from the sustained physical cost of dread. Poor sleep, less food, the constant metabolic drain of knowing that consequence is coming and not knowing exactly what shape it will take when it arrives. She walked to the end of the table and stood because there was no chair offered to her. She looked at the room. She did not look at Damien. "Say what you told Reeves," Damien said. She said it. She said all of it. The filtered messages, the deleted footage, the staged scene, the anonymous photograph sent to the house, the communications with Providence, the financial transfers, She said it in a voice that was mostly steady and occasionally not, and she said it to 17 men who listened without expression, which was somehow more difficult to endure than any reaction would have been. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Marco said, "Who authorized the Providence contact?" His voice was exactly right. Concerned, operationally focused. The voice of a man who is working the problem rather than being part of it. Damien looked at him across the table. "She did it independently," Damien said. At first, Marco nodded slowly, thoughtful, still performing. At first, Caruso repeated, catching the weight of those two words. "There's a second layer," Damien said. He picked up the remote again. "Which is why I asked you all to stay for the full hour." He switched the screen to the financial diagram Luca had built. The transaction map, the holding entity, the 3 months of embedded activity in the legitimate business structures. He let them look at it for a full 30 seconds before he spoke. "Someone used the Providence approach as cover," he said. "While we were identifying their footprint, a separate actor was running a parallel operation, positioning funds through our legitimate holdings to create the appearance of financial crime that would trigger a federal review." He let that land. He watched it move through the room. Watched 17 men understand simultaneously what federal-level exposure meant. Not for Damien specifically, but for every person sitting at that table. Because federal investigations do not stay contained to their original target. They spread. They follow money through every door it has ever touched, and they ask questions about every hand that has touched the same surfaces. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "The holding entity used in the transfer structure," Damien said, "was registered under a name from 20 years ago, a name that most of you wouldn't recognize." He paused. He looked at the diagram on the screen. He did not look at Marco yet. But the entity wasn't publicly dissolved. The banking relationship remained open, and only 2 people in the world knew that. He let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at Marco. Marco looked back at him. For one fraction of a second, the briefest possible aperture in 30 years of a composed face, something moved behind Marco's eyes. Not fear in any ordinary sense, not guilt the way most people experience guilt. Something closer to the expression of a chess player watching his opponent reach for the piece he was hoping wouldn't move. Still calculating, still somewhere inside the game, already adjusting to what came next. Then it was gone. "Damien," Marco said, "level. Genuinely level, not performed level, which was the more frightening kind because it meant the performance had become the man." "What are you saying?" "I think you know what I'm saying," Damien said. "I want to hear you say it." "All right." Damien put both hands flat on the table. "I'm saying that the financial structure used to build a federal case against this organization traces back to an entity you managed. I'm saying the timeline connects to 17 documented exchanges between you and Vanessa Hale over the past year, including 3 in the week before the incident with my wife." He held Marco's gaze without releasing it. "And I'm saying that the sophistication of this operation, the patience of it, the parallel tracks, the way the personal and financial attacks were timed to land simultaneously, required someone who understood both the architecture of this organization and the architecture of my life, intimately, over decades." Marco set his coffee cup down with a sound that was too controlled to be casual. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's a serious crime," Damien said. "You have documentation," Marco said. Not a question, an assessment. The voice of a man measuring the size of what he is now facing. "Pages 14 through 22, Damien said. Around the table, 17 men turned to pages 14 through 22. Marco did not open his packet. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at Damien, and the room held its breath around both of them. And in that moment, Damien understood something about his cousin he had never fully understood before, that Marco had always been comfortable inside these moments, that the quality that had always read as steadiness was something colder and more fundamental, an ability to exist inside catastrophe without the physical betrayals that gave most people away, without the racing pulse visible at the throat, without the dry swallow, without the involuntary tightening of the jaw. Marco had always been the calmest person in any room. Damien had spent 30 years taking that for reliability. I want to speak to you privately, Marco said. No, Damien said. Something shifted in Marco's expression, the first real visible shift of the entire morning. Damien, no, Damien said again. Whatever you have to say, you say it here. These men have a right to hear it. Everything that's been done has been done to them as much as to me. Marco looked at the table. He looked at the 17 faces around it. He looked at Luca, who had known him for 30 years, and was looking at him now with the expression of a man identifying a very old mistake in his own judgment, which is the most painful kind of mistake there is. Marco straightened in his chair. All right, he said. And then he told them, not everything, not with the thoroughness of full confession, but enough. He confirmed the holding entity. He confirmed the Vanessa communications. And here he said something that reframed the entire architecture of the betrayal in a single sentence. He had approached her, not the other way around. That detail landed in the room like a second demolition charge going off underneath the first. Vanessa received it with an expression that looked, for the first time in this entire ordeal, like genuine shock. The woman who had spent 8 months believing she was the architect of something found out in front of 17 witnesses that she had been a tool selected from a shelf. Marco confirmed the intention. Not to destroy, he said, to redirect, to create leverage sufficient to force a change of direction in an organization he believed was calcifying under the weight of Damien's refusal to adapt. Redirect me, Damien said. You've been holding this organization in place for 15 years. Something heated entered Marco's voice, not quite anger, but something that had been pressurized for a long time and had finally found an opening wide enough to move through. The same territory, the same risk structures, the same exposure profile. The world moved around us and you kept operating like it was still your father's decade. I watched it for 15 years. I told you directly. You didn't listen. So you decided to force my hand, Damien said. I decided to create conditions, Marco said, by destroying my marriage. That wasn't... He stopped. Say it, Damien said. Very quiet. The room was utterly still. Vanessa's approach to your wife wasn't part of the original plan, Marco said. His jaw was tight. She escalated beyond what you intended, Damien said. But you gave her the architecture. You gave her access to this organization's communication systems. You pointed her at my life, and you told yourself whatever story you needed to tell yourself so that what happened to Celeste could be called something other than what it was. Marco's jaw tightened further. Celeste was pregnant, Damien said. The words hit the room differently than anything else said that morning, because they were not organizational. They were not about territory or federal exposure or leverage. They were about something that existed entirely outside the language these men normally used in rooms like this one. And the sudden intrusion of that something made the air feel different in a way nobody in the room could have precisely articulated. Marco went very still. She had been in a clinic the morning before she came to that office, Damien said. His voice was controlled in the way of a man spending a significant portion of himself on maintaining that control and knowing exactly what it is costing him. She went because she was scared of losing the pregnancy for a third time. She sat there for 3 hours. The doctor told her the heartbeat was strong and to avoid stress and to rest. She left the clinic. He leaned forward slightly. And then she got in her car and she drove across the city to tell me I was going to be a father. She was coming to me because that is what you do when something terrifying turns out to be okay. You go to the person. Marco said nothing. Was that in your plan, Marco? Damien said. Was the woman carrying my child walking into that room part of the redirect? 4 seconds of silence. No, Marco said, very quiet. Does it matter? Damien said. The question sat in the room. Marco looked at him, and for the first time in 30 years of Damien's experience of him, Marco Denisi looked like a man who did not know with certainty what to do with himself. The composure did not break, but it lost its foundation. It became the composure of someone holding a position they are no longer entirely sure deserves to be held, which is a less stable and more honest thing. It matters to me, Marco said. Then carry it, Damien said. He stood. He looked at the room one last time. 17 men who would leave this building and carry what they had witnessed in their own particular directions, and the story they told from this point forward would be the one that mattered. "Everything in those packets goes to legal counsel by end of business today," he said. "The Providence matter is being handled separately. The federal exposure is being addressed through a process I'm not going to detail in this room, but which will be resolved." A pause. "I'm telling you this because you have a right to know the full scope of what was operated against this organization and by whom." He looked at Marco one final time, one last time across 30 years of everything between them. "Get him out," he said to Reeves. He walked out of the room before Marco was on his feet. The corridor outside was empty. Damien walked to the end of it and stood at the window there, a narrow window that looked north toward the part of the city that eventually dissolved into highway and then into open country. He stood with one hand on the frame and looked at the gray November sky and let himself feel, for approximately 90 seconds, the full weight of what had just happened. 30 years. He had handed Marco a place at every table, access to every structural detail of the organization, proximity to his life, to Celeste, to the losses and the Sunday dinners, and the carefully accumulated intimacy of 3 decades of believing they were the same kind of men pointed in the same direction. And Marco had used all of it, not in a moment of rage, not in desperation, with patience and planning and the cold forensic attention of someone who had looked at the relationship and identified exactly which load-bearing elements could be removed to make the structure fall. Luca appeared at his shoulder. He didn't say anything. He stood beside Damien at the window and looked at the same sky. "How long have you suspected him?" Damien said. 3 weeks, Luca said. "I wasn't certain until Reeves confirmed the account." "You didn't tell me." "No." Damien looked at him. "I needed to be sure," Luca said without apology, "and I needed you to be in a condition to hear it correctly. The first week, you weren't." Damien turned back to the window. He could not argue with that. "I'm driving north," he said. Luca looked at him. "Today," Damien said. "After this is settled, I'm going myself, no detail." "Damien, I have the footage. I have the documentation. I have everything she needs to understand what actually happened." He picked up his jacket. "But I'm not sending it through lawyers. I'm not sending Luca. I'm getting in a car and I'm going, because if she's going to decide anything about what comes next, she deserves to decide it with me standing in front of her. Not a document." Luca looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has known Damien Viscari long enough to recognize when an argument is not available. "All right," Luca said. "Handle what needs handling here. I'll be back by tomorrow." "And if she doesn't want to see you?" Luca said. Not unkindly, as a genuine question from someone who understood that the answer mattered enormously. Damien put on his jacket. "Then she tells me that herself," he said. "And I come home." He walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button. He stood and waited. And somewhere in the 40 seconds it took the elevator to arrive, his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. Reeves. A text, not a call. 4 words that made his hand tighten on the phone until his knuckles changed color. Marco didn't go quietly. The elevator arrived. Damien stepped in. He called Reeves before the doors had fully closed. "Talk," he said. "He left the building through the service entrance," Reeves said, and his voice had the quality it only had when the situation had moved past bad into something that required a completely different category of response. "We have him on camera heading east on foot. He went to a private office 2 blocks over. Corporate registration, no visible connection to the organization. We didn't know about it." "We didn't know about it," Damien repeated. "No, he's been maintaining it separately for at least 18 months based on the lease records. There's a prepaid phone inside. He made 4 calls in a 20-minute window before we got there." The elevator reached the ground floor. Damien walked through the lobby without stopping. "Who?" he said. "First call was to Providence's Eastern Operations contact. 90 seconds. Damien pushed through the front door into the cold. "Second call was to a law firm in Washington," Reeves said. "Federal practice. They handle cooperation agreements." Damien stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold November air, and the city moved around him, and he was completely still. "Third call we're still working on," Reeves said. "The fourth..." A pause. The kind Reeves used when what came next needed the other person to be prepared for it. "The fourth call was to a journalist, investigative. She has been working a piece for approximately 8 months on the intersection of organized crime and legitimate real estate holdings. Her editor is at a mid-size outlet, but she has been shopping the piece to 3 major publications. 8 months, the same timeline as everything else. He's been feeding her, Damien said. That's what the timeline suggests, Reeves said. The call today was likely a signal. Story is ready. The moment has come. Go. Damien started walking again, toward the car, toward the driver waiting at the curb. Can we stop it? He said. The publication? No. The timing? Possibly. If the legal team can establish that the information was obtained through criminal means and move for an injunction before the story goes to print. How long do we have? If they're planning the morning edition, 14 hours. Less if they put it online first. Damien got in the car. He sat with the phone against his ear and his free hand pressed flat against his knee, and he looked at the street in front of him. Marco had walked out of that meeting room after confirming in front of 17 witnesses exactly what he had done, and within 40 minutes had triggered 4 separate contingencies from a location nobody had known existed, using a phone nobody had found, before disappearing into a transit system that would take him somewhere he had already prepared. Patient, methodical, deliberate. Even at the end, still surgical. Give me Luca, Damien said. The call transferred. Luca answered in 2 rings. I know, Luca said. Before Damien could speak. The journalist, we're moving for the injunction, Luca said. It's not guaranteed. The firm says the information was obtained through documented criminal means, which is in our favor. But if she has independent sourcing that doesn't run through Marco, we cannot challenge her material. Only his contribution. So it publishes, Damien said. It may publish, Luca said. Damien, come back. Outside the car window, the city was doing what cities do. Moving, indifferent, relentless, entirely uninterested in any one man's particular disaster. Where are you? Luca said. In the car, Damien said. Come back to the building. We need you here for the legal framework, for the 17 men from this morning who are going to need to hear from you before they read a newspaper, for the... Luca, Damien said. A pause. I'm going north, Damien said. The silence on the line lasted 4 full seconds. Damien. Luca's voice carried the weight it carried when he had something to say that required the other person to be completely honest with themselves. There is a story about to be published with your name on the front page, and a federal review that starts the moment it goes live, and a cooperation agreement that Marco is structuring right now in a law office in Washington. These things require you here tonight. You have the legal team, Damien said. You have the documentation. You have everything needed to manage what's happening in that city. What you cannot do, what none of you can do, is what I am driving 4 hours to do. Those are 2 different problems. You handle yours. Another silence. All right, Luca said, quietly. Call me when you have the injunction status. And if we don't get it? Luca said. Damien looked at the road ahead of him. Then we deal with what comes after, he said. Same as always. He ended the call. He put the phone face down on the seat. He told the driver to head north, and then he sat back and looked at his own hands and thought about a woman in a coastal town who had spent the past 11 days building something real and careful out of the ruins of a morning he had failed to protect. And he thought about a story that would carry his name in the morning edition. And he thought about 17 men who had just watched 30 years get dismantled in a conference room. And he thought about Marco in a law office in Washington preparing to give the federal government everything he had accumulated in 3 decades at Damien's side. And underneath all of that, underneath the strategy and the legal exposure and the organizational machinery grinding into its crisis mode, was the one thing that none of it touched. A photograph in his shirt pocket, a heartbeat a technician had called strong, a woman who had dressed carefully and driven across the city after 3 hours in a clinic because she had believed that he was the right destination for news like that. He was going to find out whether she still believed it. He was going to stand in front of her and find out. And if she looked at him and said no, if she had already made her decision and built her walls and closed the door completely, then he would hear it from her directly, and he would drive home and he would deal with everything that was waiting for him there. But she was going to look at him when she said it, That much he was certain of. The city dissolved behind him. The highway opened up ahead, and somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet underneath everything else, was the thing Reeves had said about the 4 calls Marco had made from that private office. The first to Providence, the second to the law firm, the third still unidentified, the fourth to the journalist. 4 calls in 20 minutes from a man who had just been publicly exposed in front of every significant person in his professional life. 4 calls that were not panic, that were not the frantic scrambling of someone who had been caught and was reacting without a plan. 4 calls that were the activation of contingencies that had been built in advance and held in reserve for exactly this moment, which meant that Marco had sat in that conference room this morning, had nodded at Damien when Damien walked in, had performed concern and vindication and grim understanding through the entire meeting, already knowing that if the meeting went the way it went, these 4 calls were waiting, already knowing, and Damien had watched his face for 30 years and had not seen it. The highway moved under the car. The phone on the seat buzzed once. Damien did not look at it. He drove north into a gray afternoon with the photograph against his chest and his organization in crisis behind him and the understanding settling into him, cold and clear and irreversible, that the version of his life that would exist on the other side of tonight was going to be fundamentally and permanently different from every version that had come before. Not smaller necessarily, different. The question was whether the thing that mattered most to him would still be in it. He pressed the accelerator slightly harder. The city was gone. The road was long. And in a law office in Washington, Marco Denisi was sitting across a table from federal attorneys and beginning, in the calm and methodical voice that Damien had spent 30 years mistaking for loyalty, to give them everything. The town appeared in the windshield at 3:47 in the afternoon. Low buildings against a gray sky. The waterfront visible between rooftops. The smell of salt water reaching him through the car vent before he even cracked the window. Damien had driven the last hour without music, without calls, without the radio filling the silence the way he normally filled silences. With information, with planning, with the constant low machinery of organizational thought that had been running inside his head for 20 years. He had let it be quiet. The quiet had been harder than he expected. He parked on the street outside the clinic and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel, the engine running, looking at the building's front steps. Reeves had sent a text somewhere around the second hour of driving. One appointment remaining on the afternoon schedule, 3:15, a name flagged with a single asterisk. It was now nearly 4. She might still be inside. She might have already left through a side door and be 2 blocks away, and he would sit in this parking lot until dark, having missed her by 15 minutes. He turned off the engine. He got out. He was halfway across the parking lot when the clinic door opened. She came out wearing a coat he hadn't seen before. Soft fabric, a lighter color than she normally wore, something she had bought here in this town with her own money and her own name. She moved with the careful, deliberate pace of someone managing physical discomfort, one hand resting lightly at her side. She stopped at the top of the clinic steps and looked out at the parking lot with the unfocused gaze of someone deciding which direction to go next. She hadn't seen him yet. He had 4 seconds before she turned away. "Celeste," he said. She turned. The 4 weeks showed on her face the way time always shows when someone has been doing something genuinely hard. She was thinner. The thinness had a different quality than the thinness the fertility treatments had produced. This was leaner, more deliberate, the face of someone who had been moving forward continuously and had not had the luxury of stopping to rest. But her color was better than he had expected, and her eyes, when they found him across the parking lot and the initial shock moved through them like a current moving through water, were completely clear. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He did not move toward her. "How did you find me?" she said. "Postmark on a prescription record," he said. "I'm sorry." "For finding me or for—" "For everything," he said. "But specifically right now for finding you in a parking lot. I know this isn't—" He stopped. "There isn't a good way to do this." She was still looking at him with that measuring expression, the one he recognized from the kitchen with the lipstick, from every moment in 5 years when she had been deciding how much of the ground beneath her feet to trust and how much of it to step on carefully. "You look terrible," she said. I've had a hard month, he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something adjacent to one, reluctant and involuntary and entirely hers. Come up, she said, not warmly, not as an invitation with softness in it, as a practical decision made by a woman who was not going to stand in a parking lot in November wind for a conversation that was clearly going to take longer than a parking lot could hold. He followed her up 2 flights of stairs without speaking. The apartment was small and organized with the particular care of someone who has taken a limited space and made it mean something on purpose. The window over the kitchen table let in the salt air she had mentioned on one of the Tuesday calls. There were 2 plants on the sill that were alive and visibly thriving, which surprised him. Every plant Celeste had kept in their Manhattan apartment had died within 90 days, and he had always quietly assumed this was a permanent characteristic rather than a consequence of insufficient light. Different light here, she said, noticing him look at them. They look good, he said. Sit down. He sat at the kitchen table. She moved around the small kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned the space. Which cabinet held which thing, how far to open the window before the draft became a problem, which burner ran a 1/4 degree too hot. She had rebuilt a life here. Not a temporary one. A real one, with muscle memory and routines and a landlord named Martha who left soup outside the door on cold days without mentioning it. She put a kettle on. Tell me what's happening with the legal situation, she said, from the stove. He told her the actual texture of it, not the summary version she had heard through lawyers, the financial diagrams, the asset surrender that was coming, the oversight framework, the voluntary disclosure package that Brennan was building right now in a conference room 40 stories below where this apartment sat in the moral architecture of his life. She listened while the water boiled. She poured the tea and brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him and continued listening. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You're actually doing it, she said. Yes, he said. Not because the lawyers said to. The lawyer said to do a version of it, he said. The version I'm doing is larger. She looked at him over her tea. Why? She said. He thought about the right answer. He thought about the version of the answer that would sound best and would be technically accurate and would present him in a favorable light. He had been constructing those kinds of answers for 20 years. Because the version I would have kept, he said, is the version of me that was sitting in that office when you walked in, and I don't want to be that person anymore. She held her cup. He was wrong, she said. About some of it, Damien said. Not all. She nodded slowly. They sat with that. And then his phone started buzzing on the table between them. He glanced at the screen. Reeves. He turned it face down. It buzzed again 30 seconds later. He turned it face down again. The 3rd time it buzzed, Celeste looked at it and then looked at him. Answer it, she said. Celeste, answer the phone, Damien. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that was not a request. I'm not going anywhere. Answer it. He picked it up. Luca's voice came through before he had finished raising it to his ear. The injunction is not going to hold, Luca said. The journalist has independent sourcing. We can challenge Marco's contribution, but we cannot challenge hers. It publishes. When? Damien said. Morning edition. Online version at midnight. That's 8 hours. A pause. And Damien, Marco's cooperation deposition starts tomorrow afternoon. Full cooperation. The scope covers 18 years of organizational history. 18 years. What's in the story? Damien said. 3 properties specifically. The financial structures. The connection to the old network operations. Your name is on the front page above the fold. Damien looked at the table in front of him, at the cup of tea Celeste had put there, at his own hands wrapped around it. I'll be back by 7 a.m., he said. Damien, 7 a.m., get everyone in a room. He ended the call. Celeste was looking at him. She had heard enough, story, federal, 7 a.m., to understand the shape of what had just landed. The story runs in the morning, she said. Yes. Your name above the fold. Yes. And you're still sitting here, she said. For a little while longer, he said, like I said in the parking lot. She was quiet. Outside, the light was going, the coastal town moving through its early evening at the unhurried pace of a place with no investment in anyone else's urgency. "You're going to lose things from this," she said. "How much?" He considered the question honestly. "Significant assets, the oversight structure for 2 years minimum, whatever the Federal Review produces, which I don't fully know yet." He paused. "The version of the organization that exists tomorrow is considerably smaller than the one that exists today." She looked at the table. "Are you afraid?" she said. He looked at her. "Of exactly one thing," he said. She looked up. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, a warning from someone who knew what was coming and wasn't ready for it. "I know," he said. "I'm not going to." She exhaled. They sat in silence. Then she reached across the small table and picked up his phone. She turned it over once in her hands, looking at the dark screen, and then she set it back down facing up. "Drink your terrible coffee," she said. "It's tea," he said. "It's terrible either way," she said. "You have a long drive." He picked up the cup. He drank the terrible tea. And sitting in that small kitchen with the salt air coming through the window and the 2 plants on the sill that had somehow learned to thrive in different light, Damien Viscari understood with complete clarity that this was the most important room he had been in all month. More important than the conference room with 17 men. More important than the server room in the basement with its frozen frame of a door swinging open. More important than the hotel room where Marco had sat across from him with 30 years between them and told the truth too late and too carefully to mean what truth is supposed to mean. This kitchen. This woman. This cup of terrible tea. He finished it. He stood. She walked him to the door of the apartment and stood in the doorway while he pulled on his jacket in the hallway. "The boy needs a name," she said, quietly, setting something down rather than opening something up. He looked at her. She shook her head slightly. Not now, not tonight, not here in a hallway. And he understood. But she had said it, and that was different from not saying it. He drove back south in the dark. He answered Luca at the first toll. "The legal team is assembled," Luca said. 7 a.m., as you said. The story goes live online at midnight. Damien checked the dashboard clock. 8:47. 3 hours and 13 minutes. "What's the framing?" he said. "Alleged throughout. Sources indicate the standard legal armor. But the documentation is specific enough that the armor doesn't matter much. Photographs of the properties, account structures, timeline with Marco's name in paragraph 4 as a former associate providing corroboration. They protected him. Which meant Marco had made a deal with the publication as well as the federal office. 2 simultaneous exits, both activated the moment the meeting room became untenable. The story and the cooperation agreement running in parallel, timed to land together. Even his retreat was surgical. "The 17 men from this morning," Damien said. "Has Luca reached them?" "All of them. Caruso is steady. 3 others are nervous but manageable. 2 are making inquiries in other directions." "Which 2? Luca named them. Damien absorbed the names without surprise. "The younger ones, the transactional ones." "Let them make their inquiries," Damien said. Don't chase them. If they stay because they chose to." "You're certain?" Luca said. "Yes," Damien said. "And the voluntary disclosure that the legal team wants to know how comprehensive." Damien drove through a pool of overpass light and back into the dark. "Comprehensive," he said. "Not strategic, not calibrated to minimize. Everything that touches those 3 properties and anything structurally adjacent. Don't let the lawyers protect what doesn't need protecting at the expense of the process taking longer." A silence. "That's a significant position," Luca said carefully. "It's the right one," Damien said. Another silence. Longer this time. "All right," Luca said. The call ended. Damien drove. The story went live online at midnight exactly. His phone showed the alert. He looked at it. He did not read the story. He put the phone on the passenger seat and drove the remaining 2 hours in silence. That was not the same silence as the drive north. That silence had been the silence of a man driving towards something uncertain. This one was the silence of a man who has looked at the uncertain thing and made his decision about it and is now driving back to deal with the consequences. He slept 4 hours in the residential suite and woke at 5:45 in the dark and made coffee in the machine on the credenza and stood at the window while the city moved below him in its pre-dawn suspended state. Then he got dressed. He put the ultrasound photograph in his shirt pocket. He went downstairs. The legal meeting lasted 4 hours. Brennan drove it, federal practice lead, precise and affect neutral, and worth every dollar. And they ground through the voluntary disclosure framework piece by piece: asset surrender, compliance oversight, the forensic separation of what could be saved from what had to go. Reeves arrived at 8:15 with Marco's status. The cooperation deposition had been accepted. It would begin that afternoon. The scope covered 18 years. The federal review of the real estate holdings was now formally open. "How do we address the gap between what Marco knows and what we're disclosing?" Damien said. "We expand the disclosure," Brennan said without hesitation. "A voluntary disclosure that appears strategically incomplete looks like obstruction. A comprehensive one looks like cooperation, even if the content is difficult." "Do it," Damien said. Brennan looked at him for a fraction of a second. The slight recalibration of someone whose client has just said yes to something most clients take 3 weeks and considerable argument to arrive at. At 10:30, Luca's phone buzzed. He looked at it, stood without interrupting the current exchange, and left. He came back 4 minutes later and resumed his seat. When there was a pause in the proceedings, he leaned toward Damien. "Marco's attorney called," he said, very quietly. "His client wants a conversation before the deposition starts this afternoon. Not on the record, directly." Damien was quiet for a moment. "Set it up," he said. They met in a hotel conference room 2 blocks from the federal building. Anonymous hotel, 4th floor. A table with 4 chairs and 2 bottles of water that nobody touched. Marco came with his attorney. Damien came with Luca. Marco looked smaller, not physically. Something interior had compressed. The quality that Damien had always taken for composure, the ability to occupy a room without being diminished by whatever the room contained, had lost some structural element, and the loss was visible in the way he held himself. Not defeated exactly. Reduced. Like a building after the facade has been removed and you can see the load-bearing structure underneath for the first time. He looked, for the first time in 30 years, like a man who was genuinely tired. They sat across from each other. Marco looked at Damien. Damien looked back. Nobody spoke for a moment. The hotel's ventilation system hummed distantly. An elevator moved somewhere in the building. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Marco said. His voice was even. Not the performed evenness from the conference room. Something more stripped down than that. The evenness of someone who has stopped performing because there's no longer any audience worth performing for. "I want you to understand that first." "Then why are you here?" Damien said. "Because there are things I said in that room that were true and things that were wrong," Marco said. "And I'm going to say things under oath this afternoon that are going to cost you significantly. And I wanted—" He stopped. Something moved in his face quickly, then was controlled. "I wanted you to hear something from me directly before that happens." Damien waited. "I told myself it was about the organization," Marco said. "About the direction, the stasis, the 15 years of watching you hold something rigid that needed to move. I told myself that story for long enough that it became the whole story." He looked at the table. "It wasn't." "Then what was it?" Damien said. "It started when your father died and you took over and the whole weight of everything shifted to you," Marco said. His jaw was tight. "I was there. I did the work. Every decision, every early morning, every problem that needed 2 people to solve it. And then one day I looked up and the whole world called it yours." The room was very still. "That's what this was about," Damien said. Not a question. "That's what it started as," Marco said. "It became the organizational disagreements. Then it became Vanessa. Then Providence. Then it became a thing I had to keep making larger to justify the size of what I'd already done." "And Celeste," Damien said. Marco's jaw tightened. "She was there because she was mine," Damien said. "And taking her apart was the fastest way to take me apart. That's the whole of it." Vanessa escalated beyond— "I know what Vanessa did," Damien said. I also know you gave her the tools to do it. You pointed her at my life and you told yourself whatever you needed to tell yourself. Marco looked at the table. She was in a clinic the morning before, Damien said, scared of losing the pregnancy for the third time. Doctor told her the heartbeat was strong. She left and she drove across the city to tell me. His voice did not waver. He had made sure of that before he walked into this room. Did you know? 4 seconds. No, Marco said. Does it matter? The question sat there. Marco looked up, and for the first time in the entire morning, for the first time in 30 years, Marco Denisi looked like a man who genuinely did not know the answer to a question being put to him. It matters to me, Marco said. Very quiet. Then carry it, Damien said. He stood. I'm going to tell them everything this afternoon, Marco said. Not strategically, everything. I assumed, Damien said. I wanted you to hear it from me. Damien looked at his cousin across 30 years of Sunday dinners and shared work and the hospital waiting area and the flowers and the right words and the careful weaponization of every intimate detail. He looked at him with neither anger nor mercy, with the expression of a man who has finished grief and has not yet arrived at whatever comes after grief and is standing in the space between those two places, which is honest, if nothing else. I know, Damien said. He walked out without looking back. The deposition ran 4 days. Damien did not attend. He did not need to. Brennan sent summaries at the end of each session, clean, precise documents with the affect-neutral language of someone who has learned that what matters is accuracy rather than tone. Marco delivered everything he had promised. No strategic editing, no protective omissions. 18 years of organizational history laid out in the clipped, methodical voice of a man who had decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it completely. The Federal Review opened formally on the second day. The Providence family went quiet on the third. Without Marco's intelligence stream and without the organized disruption of Damien's network that they had been counting on, they were holding assets they didn't know how to place and a strategy that had depended on a condition that no longer existed. They pulled back. They reassessed. They were businessmen first, and businessmen understood when the terms of a deal had fundamentally changed. Brennan got the voluntary disclosure framework filed by the end of the first week. Comprehensive, as Damien had specified. Everything that touched the 3 properties and everything structurally adjacent. The federal practice described it afterward as the most complete self-disclosure they had facilitated in 14 years of practice, and they said it with the slightly disoriented respect of people who expected to spend 6 months fighting for every page and instead watched a man hand over the entire filing cabinet. The asset surrender came to 5 properties. 2 oversight mechanisms. A compliance framework administered by an external monitor for 2 years, meaning every significant financial decision in the remaining legitimate operations required review by a person Damien had not chosen and could not remove. He agreed to all of it without argument. Caruso called him the morning after the final disclosure was filed. They met for coffee at a place that had no connection to the organization. A regular place, a place with a counter and a machine and paper cups, the kind of place nobody important was ever expected to be found. Your father would have fought it, Caruso said. I know, Damien said. I'm not my father. Caruso looked at him over his cup for a long moment. No, he said finally. You're not. He said it like it wasn't a criticism. He called Celeste every Tuesday. The calls were short at first. Practical content. The pregnancy, the appointment schedule, financial support offered and accepted with the clarity of a woman who understood that her ability to make free choices was protected by not being financially pressured, and that accepting support served her independence rather than compromising it. She was, he had always known, considerably smarter than the version of her that most people constructed when they heard the name Celeste Vescari. By the second month, the calls ran 40 minutes. By the third month, she occasionally called him on days that weren't Tuesday, prefacing it with, I'm not calling because I've decided anything. I'm calling because something happened. And he would say, tell me. She told him about Martha, the landlord, who left soup outside her door on cold days without mentioning it. About the librarian who had helped her find remote work reviewing medical translation documents. She had studied languages in college, a fact he had known and somehow never absorbed as a skill she was actually using. About the morning, the nausea finally stopped and she'd eaten a full breakfast and sat at the kitchen table in the salt air and felt, she said, like herself for the first time in a very long time. He said, "That's good." She said, "I know," which was how she acknowledged his inadequacy when she was in a mood to be gentle about it. He was grateful for the gentleness. He did not say so because it would have felt like asking for credit. He drove north again in January. She had asked him to come, not to stay. The doctor wanted both parents at the next appointment, she said, if he wanted to come. She said if he wanted to in a tone that made clear the choice was real and not rhetorical. He said yes before she finished the sentence. He arrived 2 hours early and sat in his car on the street outside Martha's building because it was the only form of patience available to him. When Celeste came down at 1:30, she stopped when she saw him on the sidewalk and looked at him with the full awareness of a woman who understood that he had driven 3 hours and 40 minutes to stand on her street 2 hours before necessary. "You're early," she said. "Parking was easy," he said. She looked at him. "Come up," she said. The apartment was the same. Small, organized, the salt air through the kitchen window, the two plants on the sill that were still alive and still thriving. He sat at the kitchen table while she made tea, and this time the silence between them had a different quality than the last time. Less weight in it, not resolved. Nothing was resolved, but different. The silence of two people who have been talking on the phone for 3 months and have run out of the acute awkwardness of people who don't know each other well enough to be quiet together. They were still married. Neither of them had mentioned that. Neither of them had mentioned divorce either. "Tell me what's actually happening," she said. "Not the summary, the texture of it." He told her everything. The asset surrender, the oversight structure. The way the organization had looked on the other side of the compliance framework, considerably smaller, considerably more legitimate, and in a way he had not expected, considerably less exhausting to manage. He told her about the two men who had gone their own direction after the meeting. He told her about Caruso's coffee and what Caruso had said and the way he had said it. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're actually doing it," she said again. The same words as last time, but with a different weight in them now, because this time she had 3 months of Tuesday calls to measure them against. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. The same honest question. "Because the version I would have kept is the version of me that was sitting in that office when you walked in," he said. "And I don't want to be that person anymore. Not because of what it cost us, because I looked at what I'd built and I wasn't proud of it. I had told myself I was, for 20 years. And sitting in that room in October, listening to Marco explain what he did, I understood that I had built something that invited exactly that kind of contempt." She held her cup. "He was wrong about some of it," she said. "Not all of it," Damien said. She nodded slowly. "Tell me what you were wrong about," she said. Not an accusation. A question with a specific answer she was waiting to hear him arrive at on his own. He looked at her. "I built something I was proud of and I brought you into it, and I never asked whether it was somewhere you wanted to live," he said. "I assumed your presence was agreement. I assumed that because you stayed and because you were strong and because you never asked me to be different, that everything was fine. I didn't ask. I didn't look." He set his cup down. "You were telling me for months in messages I never received and in messages you deleted yourself because you were scared that something was wrong, and I was looking at everything except you." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's the one," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked out the window. The plants on the sill moved slightly in the draft from the cracked glass. "I deleted that message myself," she said. "The late night one, after the second loss. That's on me, not Vanessa." "I know," he said. "I should have trusted you with the fear," she said. "I kept managing it, keeping it the correct size, not giving you more than I thought you could handle. That's also what broke between us." He looked at her. "I would have wanted to know," he said. "I know that now," she said. They sat with that together. Not comfortably, but together, which was different from how it had been for the last year of their marriage, when everything difficult had been managed in separate silences and carried in separate rooms. He reached into his jacket pocket. He put both photographs on the table between them, the worn one from October and the newer one she had handed him in the parking lot, both of them side by side on the kitchen table. She looked at them. She reached out and picked up the worn one, held it, turned it over once in her hands, looking at the edges softened from being taken out and put back too many times. "You've been carrying this," she said. "Since the day I picked it up off the floor," he said. She set it back down gently, face up, next to its companion. "My son needs a father," she said, carefully, precisely. Not as an opening, but as a statement of what was true. Not a famous one, not a feared one, a present one who shows up when it's hard and stays when it's boring and is there in the ordinary parts. "I understand," he said. "I don't think you fully do yet," she said. "I think you understand it as a concept. The actual experience of ordinariness is going to be harder for you than you're accounting for." He considered that honestly. "You're probably right," he said. "I know I am," she said, "which is why I'm not making a decision today. I'm going to watch you be ordinary for a while. Appointments, dinners that don't matter, Tuesday calls that are boring because nothing happened. If you can do that without needing it to be meaningful every time." She stopped. "Then we'll see." He nodded. "How long?" he said. "As long as it takes," she said. "Don't ask me that again." "All right," he said. She stood. "We should go eat," she said. "The appointment is at 2. They walked to the clinic 2 blocks away, and the wind off the water was cold and sharp, and she walked slightly ahead of him on the narrow sidewalk, the way people walk when they are not yet walking together, but are not walking apart either. He matched her pace without closing the distance between them. He let her set the pace. He was learning that. The waiting room at the clinic was bland and bright, the kind of room designed to be as unoffensive as possible to as many different kinds of people as possible, and they sat in adjacent chairs with one empty chair between them, and Celeste filled out a form on a clipboard, and Damien sat with his hands on his knees and watched the wall in front of him. "You can breathe," she said, without looking up from the form. "I'm breathing," he said. "You're not," she said. He exhaled deliberately. She was right. He hadn't noticed. The technician called her name. Celeste stood and looked at him once. A look that was not an invitation and not a refusal. That was simply a look from one person to another that contained too many things to separate cleanly. And then she said, "Come on then." He stood. He followed her through the door, and standing in that small room with the equipment humming and the technician preparing the screen, and Celeste lying back with the particular stillness of a woman who has been in this room many times before. Under many different emotional conditions, Damien Vescari stood at the side of the table and looked at the screen and saw his son for the first time in a way that was not a photograph. Moving, the hands visible, small and blurred at the edges, more suggestion than detail, but unmistakably hands. Reaching in the specific purposeless way of someone who exists and is in the process of becoming and is reaching toward nothing in particular because everything is equally new. The technician said something about measurements, about positioning, about a perfectly normal, healthy, strong progression. Damien heard the word strong and could not speak for a moment. Celeste turned her head and looked at him from the table. He looked back at her. She reached out her hand. He took it, not firmly, not as a statement. Just her hand in his, the way you hold something you are not certain belongs to you yet, but are not ready to let go of either. The technician printed the image. She handed it to him. He held it with both hands. And standing in that clinic room in a coastal town 300 miles north of the city, holding a photograph of his son and his wife's hand simultaneously, Damien understood with complete and irreversible clarity that the thing he had almost lost was not the organization, was not the name, was not the assets or the territory, or the fear he had spent 20 years cultivating in rooms full of dangerous men. It was this, just this. The question that remained, The one that had no answer yet and would not have one today and possibly would not have one for months, was whether he had arrived at this understanding in time, whether she would let him stay. Outside the clinic window, the coastal afternoon was going gray and cold, and in the city behind him an organization was restructuring under compliance oversight, and a journalist's story was entering its second news cycle, and a federal review was grinding through its methodical process, and Marco Denisi was somewhere in a federal facility answering questions in the calm, precise voice that Damien had spent 30 years mistaking for something it was not. All of that was happening. All of that would continue to happen. And Damien stood in a small clinic room holding a photograph and a hand and let it happen without him for one more minute, and then another after that, because some things, the things that actually matter, require you to stop running the machinery. She let go of his hand first, not abruptly, not as a statement. The way you let go of something when the moment that required holding it has passed, and you are both still standing, and the technician is printing a second copy of the image, and the ordinary machinery of the appointment is resuming around you. Celeste lowered her hand to the table beside her and looked at the ceiling for a moment with her eyes very clear, and her expression doing something complicated that she was not quite managing to keep entirely private. Damien looked at the image in his hands. The technician said something about scheduling the next appointment. Celeste answered in the precise, practical tone she used for medical logistics, the tone that had carried her through 14 months of clinic rooms and waiting areas and parking lot phone calls, the tone of a woman who had learned to manage the administrative architecture of hope, because it was the only part of hope she could reliably control. Damien folded the image carefully. He put it in his shirt pocket alongside the worn one. 2 photographs now, pressed flat against his chest. They walked out of the clinic together into the cold January afternoon and stood on the top step for a moment, both of them looking at the street below without particular purpose. "The next one is in 6 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll come." She nodded. She pulled her coat tighter at the collar with one hand. "Are you driving back tonight?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I told Luca 7 a.m. She nodded again. A motion that contained more than agreement, something being weighed, something being measured against something else that only she had access to. "There's a place 2 blocks that way," she said. "The coffee is genuinely terrible, but it's warm." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. They walked. The coffee place was exactly as she had described it the first time. The kind of establishment that exists in small coastal towns because someone needed a place for it to exist, not because anyone had a strong vision for what it should be. A counter, a machine, paper cups, 3 small tables near the window with chairs that didn't quite match. The woman behind the counter knew Celeste by some shorthand. A nod, a cup started before the order was given, and looked at Damien once with the measured curiosity of someone in a small town seeing a new face beside a familiar one. They sat at the table nearest the window. Outside, the afternoon was fully gray now, the light going flat over the water, the street quiet in the way of January weekdays in places where the summer visitors are a memory and the town has returned to being something it only is when no one is watching it. Celeste wrapped both hands around her cup. "Tell me about Luca," she said. "Ferris. How is he actually?" It surprised him, the specificity of it, the care embedded in the question. "He's well," Damien said. "He's been—" He stopped, considered how to say it accurately. "He's been the thing that held the center when the center could have gone, in ways I didn't ask him to and wouldn't have known to ask." Celeste looked at her cup. "He called me," she said. Damien looked at her. "Once," she said. "About 6 weeks in. Not to pressure me. Not to deliver a message or ask for anything. He called to tell me that the footage existed and that I would see it when I was ready. That was all he said. Then he asked if I was eating enough, and I told him it was none of his business. And he said, 'You're right. I apologize.' And then he said goodbye." Damien was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know he called," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "He did it on his own." She looked out the window. "I hung up on him the first time he tried. He called back the next day at the same time." Damien looked at his coffee. Terrible, as advertised. He drank it anyway. The name, he said, carefully, not pushing, placing it gently on the table between them the way you place something fragile on a surface you're not sure will hold. She looked at him. Luca, she said, if you agree. He did not answer immediately. He sat with it. Not because he was uncertain. He had known the moment she said it in the apartment weeks ago that it was right, but because some things deserve more than an immediate answer. Because some things require you to actually feel the weight of them before you respond, rather than moving through the feeling toward the response out of habit. Yes, he said. She looked back out the window. The woman behind the counter was wiping down the machine. Outside, a man walked past with a dog that was unhappy about the cold. The ordinary afternoon of a place that did not know or care that anything significant was happening inside it. I need to tell you something, Celeste said, still looking at the window. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. All right, he said. She turned and looked at him directly. I thought about not coming back, she said. Not as a threat. Not as a strategy. I genuinely thought about building something here and staying in it, and raising him in a place where nobody knew the Viscari name, and nobody would ever connect him to any of it. I thought about that seriously for about 3 weeks, and I had the shape of it in my head, what it would look like, what I would tell him when he was old enough to ask questions. I had the whole thing. Damien held very still. I'm telling you that, she said, because I don't want you to think this decision, whatever it ends up being, is something that came easily. I don't want you to carry the idea that I was waiting for the right explanation and you came along and gave it to me and everything was fine. Her voice was steady, not cold, precise. The voice of a woman who has had 3 months to find exactly the right words for something important and has finally found them. It wasn't like that. I know, he said. Let me finish, she said. He closed his mouth. What changed, she said, was not the footage. The footage mattered. It changed the facts, and the facts matter. But facts don't change the thing underneath the facts. What I saw when I walked into that office was a version of you that I was afraid had always been there, that I had been choosing not to see. And no footage changes whether that version is real. Celeste? I said, let me finish, she said. Not sharply, with the particular firmness of a woman who has had to develop that firmness the hard way and is not going to apologize for it. He stopped. What changed, she said again more quietly, was the Tuesday calls. Not the first ones. Those were practical, and practical was fine. But practical wasn't the thing. It was the fourth one. The one where nothing had happened, and you called anyway, and when I said nothing happened, you said, I know, I just wanted to hear your voice, and then you sat there on the phone for 8 minutes while I folded laundry, and we didn't talk about anything. She looked at him. That was the one. He looked at her. 8 minutes of you being quiet with me while I folded laundry, she said. That was apparently what it took. He did not know what to do with his face for a moment. You could have told me that, he said. No, she said, because if I had told you, you would have done it on purpose. And then it would have been a strategy. And I've had enough of living inside someone else's strategy. He looked at the table. He looked back at her. I'm not asking you to come home today, she said. I'm not making any large decision in a coffee place in January while I'm 32 weeks pregnant, and you have a federal compliance monitor reviewing your financial decisions, and we haven't had a real argument yet about any of the things we're actually going to have to argue about. What things? He said. Whether the boy grows up knowing what his father does for a living, she said. What version of it he knows and when and how. What my name is on the mailbox. Whether the apartment in Manhattan or somewhere else entirely. Whether the Tuesday calls stay Tuesday calls or become something that requires more negotiating than that. She ticked through them without drama. Items on a list. Things that were real and required real answers. Those things. Those are reasonable things, he said. I know they're reasonable, she said. I'm not asking for a response to any of them today. I'm telling you they exist so that you know what you're agreeing to continue when you drive back tonight. He looked at her for a moment. I know what I'm agreeing to, he said. Do you? She said. Yes, he said. I'm agreeing to the laundry calls and the arguments and the things that need negotiating. I'm agreeing to show up at the 6-week appointment and the one after that. I'm agreeing to be the ordinary version of myself for as long as it takes for that to mean something to you." He paused. "I'm agreeing to earn it." She looked at him. For a long moment, she looked at him with the measuring expression, the one that had always, in 5 years of marriage, seen more of him than he was trying to show. Seeing all of him now, in a coffee place in January, in a coastal town that smelled like salt water, and the particular quiet of a life rebuilt from practical decisions and small dignities. "Okay," she said. "Just that. One word. Not warmly, not with ceremony. The way you say okay when you mean it as something real rather than as a performance of agreement." "Okay," he said back. She finished her terrible coffee. He finished his. They sat for another 20 minutes and talked about nothing in particular. The plants on the sill, Martha's soup, a library book she was reading that she described as either terrible or brilliant and wasn't sure which, a problem with the secondhand car's heating system that she had been managing with a blanket on the passenger seat. He listened to all of it. He did not offer to fix the car or replace it or deploy anything. He listened. When she stood to leave, he stood too. Outside on the sidewalk, she pulled her coat tight again against the wind. "Drive carefully," she said. "I will," he said. She looked at him once more, the last look of the evening, the one that carried everything still unresolved alongside everything that had quietly shifted. And then she turned and walked back toward Martha's building, and he stood on the sidewalk and watched until she was through the door. Then he got in the car and drove south into the dark. The boy was born on a Thursday morning in April. Damien was in the waiting area, not in the room, but that was her decision, made clearly and without apology, and he had respected it without argument because he understood that some things were not his to negotiate, and this was one of them. The waiting area was the same kind of waiting area as every other hospital waiting area in every city. Bland, bright, plastic chairs, a television mounted high on the wall showing something nobody was watching. He sat in one of the plastic chairs with his hands on his knees, and he waited. Luca called twice. He sent both calls to voicemail without looking at what else might be going on in the city behind him, in the compliance framework and the federal review, and the restructured organization that was now, 4 months into its new shape, beginning to find its footing in the way that things find their footing when they have been stripped to what is actually load-bearing and built back up from there. All of that was happening. He was in a plastic chair watching a television he wasn't watching. At 4:47 in the morning, a nurse came and said his name and told him he could come through. He stood. He walked down a corridor that was exactly as long as it needed to be and no longer. He stood in the doorway. Celeste was in the bed with her eyes open and her hair loose and an expression on her face that he had never seen there before. Not because it was foreign to her, but because the circumstances producing it had never existed before. The specific combination of exhaustion and completion and something much larger than either, something that did not have a precise name, but that anyone who has been in that room recognizes immediately. She was holding the boy. He was very small, dark hair, which Damien had not expected, eyes closed, one hand curled against his cheek in the specific, unselfconscious way of someone new enough to the world that they have not yet learned to manage what their hands do. Damien stood in the doorway. He did not move, because he was not entirely certain his legs were going to be reliable for the next several seconds, and he was not going to manage that situation by falling down. "Come in," Celeste said. Her voice was rough and quiet and entirely, completely herself. He crossed the room. He stood beside the bed. He looked at his son. The boy stirred. Some small internal adjustment. His hand moved from his cheek and opened and then closed once. A deliberate motion with no target, reaching toward nothing and everything simultaneously, the way you reach when everything is equally new and you do not yet know what any of it is. "Luca," Celeste said. Damien looked at her. "His name," she said, "if you still agree." He looked at the boy. Luca. After a man who had stayed in the room when everyone else was finding reasons to leave. After 60 years of folded hands and patient silence and the particular loyalty that does not announce itself and does not require an audience. After the quality of being present that Damien had spent 30 years surrounded by and 20 years failing to practice. "Yes," he said. His voice did not behave perfectly. He let it not behave. Celeste looked at him with the measuring expression. And then she looked at him with something else, something underneath the measuring, something she had been keeping very carefully in reserve for the entire length of this ordeal, something that had survived the parking lot and the bad coffee place and the clinic room and the laundry calls and the January appointment and every Tuesday in between. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was more complicated than forgiveness and less dramatic than it and considerably more useful. It was the look of a woman who has decided, not lightly, not cheaply, not without full knowledge of every reason she could have decided otherwise, to keep the door open. "Sit down," she said. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. She shifted slightly and adjusted the boy's angle, not handing him over, not yet, changing the position so that Damien could see him in the full light of the room. She was giving him the look, giving him the fact of the boy's face in proper light, the way you offer something to someone when you have decided they have earned the offering. He reached out. His hands were not steady. He was aware of that. He was not going to pretend otherwise. He held his son for the first time at 4:53 in the morning, and the boy weighed almost nothing and weighed everything at once, and Damien Vescari sat in a plastic hospital chair and felt, in a way he had not felt anything in a very long time, the full and unmanageable weight of a thing he could not protect through force of will alone. Through reputation, through strategy, through the organizational machinery he had spent 20 years maintaining. This required something different. This required him to show up every day, in the ordinary parts, in the parts that didn't mean anything individually and meant everything in accumulation. He looked at his son's face. The boy made a sound, small, not quite crying, somewhere between a sound and a breath, the sound of a person getting used to the air and finding it more or less acceptable. "Hey," Damien said quietly. To the boy. To the room. To whatever version of himself had driven 4 hours north with no plan and arrived in a parking lot looking the way he had looked. The boy's hand found his finger, wrapped around it, held on. Outside the window, the coast was going gray with early light, the particular pre-dawn gray that comes before color returns to the world, before the sky commits to any particular version of the day. The sound of water was faint through the glass, steady and present the way the sea is always present, not caring, not helping, just there, the way the real things always are. Celeste watched him hold their son. She reached over. She put her hand over his, over the hand that was holding the boy. Not firmly, not as a statement, not as a performance of anything, just resting there. The way you rest your hand on something you are not fully certain about yet, but have decided to stay beside anyway. The three of them were quiet. The gray light outside moved toward something warmer. Damien drove back to the city that afternoon. Not because he wanted to, because there were things that required him there, and he had made a promise to Luca that he was going to be the kind of man who showed up for the things he had promised, even the unglamorous ones, even the ones that took him away from the room he wanted to be in. He called Luca from the highway. Luca answered on the first ring. "The boy is here," Damien said. A silence. "Good," Luca said, the single word carrying more than most men could fit in a paragraph. "His name is Luca," Damien said. Another silence. Longer. "That's..." Luca stopped. Started again. "That's not necessary." "No," Damien said. "It's accurate." Luca was quiet for a moment. "How is she?" he said. "She's herself," Damien said. "Completely." "Good," Luca said again. "That's the best thing she can be." Damien drove. The coast receded behind him, and the highway opened up and the city appeared eventually in the distance. The skyline coming into view the way it always did, familiar and massive and entirely uninterested in the specific weight of any one individual's week. "The compliance monitor filed his first quarterly report," Luca said. "Brennan says it's clean." "Good," Damien said. "Caruso wants a meeting next week. Organizational structure going forward. He has ideas." "Set it up," Damien said. "And the two men who went their own direction after October," Luca said. "One of them called yesterday. He wants back in." Damien considered this. "Tell him not yet," he said. "Tell him to call again in 6 months. If the answer is yes, then It'll be yes because it means something, not because we needed him back fast enough to take him. He won't like that, Luca said. No, Damien said, but he'll understand it. A brief silence. You've changed, Luca said, not as a compliment or criticism, as an observation from a man who had been watching people change or fail to change for 60 years and had learned to note it accurately when it happened. I'm working on it, Damien said. No, Luca said. You've changed. The working on it was the last 4 months. This is something past that. Damien drove. He thought about that for a while. About the difference between working on something and having become it. About whether those two things were ever cleanly separate, or whether the becoming was just the working on it accumulated past a point you couldn't identify in advance and could only recognize afterward. He thought about a plastic hospital chair and a boy's hand around his finger. Luca, he said. Yes. Thank you for calling her, he said. 6 weeks in, the footage. A pause. You weren't going to tell me, Damien said. Were you? No, Luca said. Why are you telling me now? Because now it doesn't matter what I intended, Luca said. Now it's just a thing that happened that turned out to be right. Damien was quiet. Go home, Luca said. Sleep. The meeting is Tuesday. I'll be there, Damien said. He ended the call. He drove the rest of the way in silence. The compliance framework ran for 2 years. The external monitor filed quarterly reports that Brennan reviewed and occasionally contested on technical grounds, and more often accepted because they were accurate, and accuracy, Damien had decided, was worth more than contested ground. The Federal Review completed its process in 14 months and arrived at conclusions that were within the boundaries of what the voluntary disclosure had already addressed, which was not luck and was not accident. It was Brennan's architecture and Luca's patience, and Damien's decision on a highway in November to make the disclosure comprehensive rather than strategic. 5 properties gone. The organization smaller. The name carrying a different weight in different rooms than it had carried before. Not less feared exactly, but feared for different reasons, which was a distinction that took some getting used to for the men who had been in those rooms for 20 years. Marco's cooperation agreement ran through the Federal Review and then concluded. His name disappeared from the news cycle the way names do when the story they're attached to has finished its arc. Damien did not know where Marco went after. He did not ask. Some doors, once closed, do not need to be opened to understand that they are permanently shut. Vanessa Hale relocated to another city. Damien knew this because Reeves told him once, without being asked, and Damien said thank you, and that was the last time either of them mentioned her name. The journalist published a follow-up piece 8 months later examining the voluntary disclosure process and what it represented in the context of organized crime's intersection with legitimate real estate holdings. The piece was fair. It said what it said, and it was true. And Damien did not issue a statement. Caruso called and asked if he wanted to respond, and Damien said no. The facts are in the piece. I don't have a more flattering version to offer. Caruso was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father would have hated this. And Damien said, yes. And then he said, I think that's probably the right sign. Celeste moved back to the city in June. Not to the Manhattan apartment. They had agreed on that point without significant argument, which surprised both of them. Too much weight in those rooms. Too many specific memories attached to specific corners. They found something else. Smaller than the Manhattan place, in a different neighborhood, with a kitchen that had a window that let in a different kind of light than the salt air window in the coastal town, but that Celeste stood in front of on the first morning and said, That'll work. The 2 plants came with her. They were still alive. He had said something about that, about the fact of the plants still being alive, and she had looked at him with an expression he recognized as the look she used when he had said something obvious that she was choosing to find charming rather than annoying. Plants live when you pay attention to them, she said. Yes, he said. He understood that she was not only talking about the plants. They argued about the boy's schooling in August. Not badly, but genuinely, the way 2 people argue when they both have strong opinions and have been right about different things in recent memory and know it. They argued about what to tell him and when. About the version of his father's work that was age-appropriate at various stages. about the specific language to use when a child old enough to ask questions started asking them. They did not resolve all of it in August. They were still working on parts of it when the boy was 1, and when he was 2 and starting to point at things and say their names with the specific delight of someone discovering that the world has names. And when he was 3 and asking about the photograph on the bookshelf, the worn one, in a small frame now, the ultrasound image that Damien had carried in his shirt pocket for 6 months. And Celeste had said, "That's you," before you were born. And the boy had looked at it very seriously for a long time, and then looked at Damien and said, "That doesn't look like me." And Damien had said, "No, you look considerably better now." And the boy had accepted this as satisfactory and moved on. The Tuesday calls became Tuesday dinners. Then they became just dinners without a fixed day, because fixed days had been necessary when there was distance to manage, and the distance was gone. There were difficult months. There was one in particular. The boy was almost 2, a routine appointment that came back with a finding that required monitoring. Nothing serious, but nothing. Nothing either, and Celeste had called him from the clinic parking lot the way she had once received bad news in parking lots alone. And he had been on the highway in 35 minutes, and in the clinic with her in just over an hour, and they had sat in the plastic chairs together and waited together, and the finding resolved to nothing, as most findings that require monitoring ultimately do. But they had sat in those chairs together, and that was different from how it had been. And both of them understood the difference without naming it. He showed up. He showed up when it was hard, and he showed up when it was boring, and he showed up when nothing was happening, and the boy was asleep, and the dinner was ordinary, and there was nothing meaningful about the evening at all, except that he was there in it. He was learning to let that be enough. Some evenings it still required effort. He was not going to pretend otherwise. 20 years of running organizational machinery at full capacity does not simply switch off, and there were nights when the quiet of an ordinary evening felt like something his nervous system did not know how to process, when some part of him reached for the problem to solve, the strategy to run, the leverage to find. On those nights, he would sometimes go to the kitchen and make tea that nobody asked for and stand at the window for a few minutes and then bring the tea back and sit down again. Celeste noticed. She didn't comment on it for several months. Then one evening she said, "You do that thing with the tea when you need to decompress." He said, "I know." She said, "It's fine. Just so you know, I see it." He said, "Thank you for seeing it." She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. The measuring expression had not gone away. He did not think it ever would entirely, and he had come to understand that this was not a failure of trust, but a form of attention, the attention of a woman who had learned the hard way to look carefully at the ground before she stepped on it. He had been part of what taught her that. He was not going to ask her to unlearn it. He was going to keep being worth looking at carefully. That was the work. Not dramatic, not requiring an audience. Just the daily, accumulating work of being present in the specific way that presence is useful. On a Tuesday evening in November, 2 years after the morning that had rearranged both their lives, Damien was sitting at the kitchen table helping the boy with something that was not yet drawing but was the enthusiastic precursor to it, involving a lot of blue crayon and no particular plan, when Celeste came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them. He felt her looking. He looked up. She was leaning against the door frame with her arms loosely crossed, and her expression was one he had not seen before. Not the measuring one, not the complicated one from the clinic room, not the careful one from the bad coffee place in January. Something simpler than all of those. Something that only exists on the face of a person who is looking at something they did not fully believe they would have and have it anyway, and are letting themselves feel the weight of that without immediately managing it into something smaller. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." The boy held up the paper. "Look," he said, to his father, with the specific urgency of a 2-year-old who has produced something he considers significant. Damien looked at it. Blue. Everywhere. Some additional blue. A circle in the upper left corner that may have been intentional. "That's excellent," Damien said. The boy seemed to find this adequate. He went back to the blue crayon. Celeste pushed off from the doorframe and came to the table and sat down in the third chair, not across from Damien, beside him, and picked up the green crayon from the small pile in the center of the table and handed it to the boy without comment, And the boy received it with the seriousness of someone who has been given exactly the tool they needed at exactly the right moment, and began adding green to the blue. The three of them sat around the kitchen table. The boy drew. The evening light came through the kitchen window at the angle it came through at this time of year. The low, warm light of late autumn, the kind that makes ordinary rooms look briefly like something more than what they are. It moved across the table, across the boy's bent head, the dark hair that still surprised Damien sometimes. Across Celeste's hands, the same hands that had held an envelope in an elevator 11 days north of the worst morning of both their lives, and had been steady. Across the worn ultrasound photograph in the small frame on the bookshelf in the next room, the kidney bean with its arrow pointing to a heartbeat that a technician had called strong. Strong. The word had traveled a long way. Through 14 months of treatments and 2 losses and a clinic parking lot at 3 a.m. and a diner booth and a motel room and 400 miles of highway in the dark and a server room in a basement and a conference room with 17 men and a hotel table with 30 years across it and a coastal town and a bad coffee place and a January appointment and a waiting area at 4 a.m. and a plastic chair and a boy's hand around a finger. Strong. It had arrived here. At this table. At this evening. At this ordinary and unremarkable and completely sufficient moment, which was the only kind of moment that actually mattered, and which Damien Vescari was, at last, learning to recognize while he was inside it, rather than only understanding its value once it was gone. The boy looked up. He looked at his father. "More," he said, meaning more crayon, more time, more evening, more of this specific configuration of people at this specific table. Damien picked up the red crayon. "More," he agreed. And outside the kitchen window, the city went on being the city. Indifferent, relentless, 10,000 lives grinding forward in their 10,000 directions. And inside the kitchen, the light moved slowly across the table the way light moves when no one is rushing it. And the boy drew, and the evening held, and that was all. That was everything. That was enough.